The strap on her left sandal snapped. That was what Elisa Russell was thinking about when they came for her. Not the heavy boots on the porch. Not her father's voice, low and transactional the way he sounded when he was negotiating the price of grain or the sale of a lame horse. Not even the iron smell of the blood moon rising fat and copper red over the ridge, casting the whole village in a light that made everything look like it was already bleeding. No. Elisa was thinking about the sandal. She'd repaired it twice already, once with a strip of leather she'd cut from an old belt, and once with twine that left a rough knot against her ankle bone. The knot had rubbed a blister there, a small, angry circle of raw skin that she'd been pressing her thumb against all evening, the little sting of it grounding her, keeping her inside her own body, while the world outside prepared to throw her out of it. The front door opened. She didn't look up. Her father stood in the doorway with two men she'd never seen before. One was tall and lean, dressed in the dark traveling leathers of a border convoy. The other was shorter, broader, with a ledger tucked under his arm and ink stains on his fingers. A bookkeeper, a counter of things. Her father didn't say her name. He said, "That one," and pointed the way you'd point at a sack of flour you wanted loaded onto a cart. Elisa pressed her thumb harder into the blister. She'd known this was coming. Not the way you know a storm is coming, with dread and preparation and the desperate boarding up of windows. No. She'd known the way you know winter is coming, with a bone-deep certainty that required no emotion at all, just patience, just the quiet understanding that the cold would arrive, and she would not be dressed for it, and nobody would think to hand her a coat. She was 22 years old. She had no wolf. She had no mate. She had no value that her father's arithmetic could quantify, and in a pack where your worth was measured by what you could shift into, fight beside, or breed, Elisa Russell had been running a deficit since birth. The man with the ledger opened it, licked his thumb, and turned to a page near the back. "Tribute 7, he said, without looking at her. "Female, wolfless, unmated." He paused, glanced at her father. "Fertile?" Her father shrugged. That shrug. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Not because it was cruel. Cruelty required intention, and her father had none. It was the shrug of a man who had simply never gathered that particular piece of information because it had never been relevant to any transaction he'd considered. His daughter's ability to bear children was data he'd never needed, so he'd never collected it. She might as well have been furniture. "Get your things," the tall man said to her. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way someone would say, "The cart leaves at dawn," with the flat pragmatism of a schedule that did not care about her feelings. Elisa stood. She didn't pack a bag because she didn't have anything worth packing. She owned 2 dresses, both threadbare, a wooden comb with 3 missing teeth, a book of stories she'd read so many times the pages were as soft as skin. She left it on the bed. Stories were for people who still believed things could change. She walked through the front room, past her mother, who was stirring a pot of stew and did not stop stirring, past the small wooden table where her sister Nadine sat nursing her infant son. Nadine looked up. For a moment, just a moment, something moved behind her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of guilt. The memory of a time when they'd shared a bed as children, and Nadine had promised to always protect her. But Nadine had a wolf. Nadine had a mate. Nadine had a child. Nadine had everything the pack valued, which meant Nadine had everything to lose by speaking up and nothing to gain. She looked back down at her baby. Elisa walked out the door and into the copper light of the blood moon, and nobody in that house said goodbye. Chapter 1. Cargo. The convoy was smaller than she'd expected. 3 wagons, each loaded with tribute goods bound for the Alpha King's territory. Iron ore, cured pelts, barrels of salted fish, and 7 bodies. The bodies were the least valuable cargo. Elisa could tell by the way they were arranged, crammed into the last wagon, sitting on the bare wooden bed with no cushioning, no cover, and no separation from the crates of dried grain stacked around them. 7 tributes. 7 lives weighed against a blood moon treaty that had kept the border packs from being absorbed, or annihilated, by the Alpha King's territory for the last 40 years. She climbed into the wagon without being told. The other 6 were already there. 3 women, 2 men, 1 boy who couldn't have been more than 16, his eyes so wide and unblinking that Elisa knew he hadn't slept since they'd taken him. He was sitting with his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly, and the motion reminded her of the way saplings moved in a storm, not because they wanted to, but because the wind wouldn't let them be still. The woman beside her was older, mid-40s maybe, hard hands, harder face. She had the look of someone who'd been through this before, and when Elisa settled onto the rough planks beside her, the woman glanced over and gave her a single, comprehensive look, the kind that cataloged everything about a person in 2 seconds and decided exactly how much attention they deserved. "First time?" the woman asked. Elisa nodded. "You'll survive the ride. It's 3 days to the capital. They'll feed us once a day. Enough to keep us alive, not enough to keep us strong. Don't drink the water too fast. They won't refill your skin until morning." She paused. "You got a wolf?" "No." The woman made a sound in the back of her throat. Not pity, assessment. "Then pray he picks you fast. The ones who sit in the holding cells too long start losing themselves. I've seen tributes come back from that palace with 10 years added to their faces and nothing behind their eyes." "Come back?" Elisa said. "Sometimes. If the king's wolf rejects the offering, they sell you downriver. Fighting pits mostly. Breeding camps if you're young enough." She looked at Elisa again, more carefully this time. "You're young enough." The wagon lurched forward, and Elisa grabbed the side rail to steady herself. The village was already shrinking behind them, the clustered homes, the smoke from evening fires, the tall oak at the center of the square where pat gatherings were held. She'd climbed that tree once, as a girl, sat in its branches and pretended she was somewhere else. Somewhere her body wasn't a ledger entry, and her worth wasn't a number someone else decided. She watched until the village disappeared behind a ridge, and then she let herself feel what she'd been holding back since her father pointed at her and said, "That one." Nothing. She felt nothing, and that terrified her more than grief would have. The first day passed in dust and silence. The convoy moved along a ridge road that cut through high grassland, and the wind up there was sharp enough to sting. Elisa sat with her back against a grain crate and watched the landscape change, from the scrubby lowlands she'd known her whole life to something wilder, more open, like the land itself was taking a deeper breath. The boy, she learned his name was Sammy Lacey, whispered to her by the woman beside her, whose name was Dorothy Charles, didn't speak for the entire first day. He just rocked and stared, and occasionally pressed his hand to his chest like he was checking for something that should have been there and wasn't. "His wolf came in last month," Dorothy said quietly. "First shift. But it's small, weak. His pack decided a weak wolf was worse than no wolf at all. More embarrassing. So they sent him his tribute. His grandmother did. His parents are dead." Elisa looked at Sammy Lacey, with his 2 wide eyes and his hand over his heart, and felt something she hadn't expected. A pulling sensation. Not emotional, physical. A tightness in her own chest, an echo of the pressure he was pressing against in his. She could feel his fear. Not metaphorically. Not in the way people say, "I could feel her sadness," when they mean they recognized it. Elisa could feel Sammy Lacey's fear as a physical sensation in her own sternum, a cold, clenching weight, like a fist squeezing her lungs. She'd had this her entire life, this defect, this wrong wiring that turned other people's pain into her own body's problem. When she was 6, she'd collapsed screaming in the village square because an elder 3 houses away was having a heart attack. When she was 12, she'd limped for a week because a trader passing through town had a shattered kneecap she could feel grinding in her own leg. The pack healer had examined her, found nothing physically wrong, and declared her sensitive. The word was spoken the way people say difficult or inconvenient, something to be managed, not understood. Her mother had taken her to 3 different healers after that. Each one had poked and prodded and come to the same conclusion. She wasn't psychic, she wasn't gifted, she wasn't anything useful. She was just porous. thin-skinned in a way that went past metaphor and into the literal. Other people's suffering leaked into her the way water leaks through bad mortar. The pack's final verdict: defective. Her mother's final verdict: disappointing. Her father's final verdict: worthless. And now she sat in a tribute wagon, cargo among cargo, and felt a teenage boy's terror beating inside her chest like a second heart, and she did what she always did with other people's pain. She carried it, quietly, without telling anyone. On the second night, one of the convoy guards brought water. He moved down the line of tributes methodically, a ladle and a wooden cup, one pour per person, efficient and impersonal. But when he reached Elisa, he paused. He was young, mid-20s maybe, broad-shouldered in the way of wolves who shifted often, with the easy, unconscious physicality that came from living in two bodies. His name was stitched into his leather vest: Darren. "You haven't eaten," he said. She looked at the dried meat they'd been given that morning. She'd handed hers to Sammy without thinking about it. "I'm not hungry." He studied her for a moment, then set the water cup on the wagon's edge and reached into his own pack. He pulled out a piece of bread, real bread, soft and still faintly warm, and held it out to her. She stared at it. "Take it," he said. "It's a long ride." She took the bread, and as her fingers closed around it, something terrible happened. Her eyes burned, not from dust, not from the wind, from the simple, devastating reality that a stranger handing her bread was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months, maybe years. The bar for human decency in her life was so low that a piece of bread from a convoy guard was enough to crack the wall she'd built around everything she felt. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 14, and she wasn't going to start now, in a wagon full of strangers, over a piece of bread. But she felt the tears there, pooled behind her eyes like floodwater behind a dam, and she understood with sudden, horrible clarity exactly how starved she was. Not for food, for someone, anyone, to look at her and see a person instead of a problem. "Thank you," she whispered. The guard, Darren, nodded once, then moved on to the next tribute. He didn't look back. It wasn't a significant moment for him. He'd probably forget it by morning. Elisa would remember it for the rest of her life. She ate the bread slowly, pressing each bite against the roof of her mouth, and watched the blood moon track across the sky like a wound that wouldn't close. Chapter 2. The King Who Wouldn't Stop Bleeding. They smelled the capital before they saw it. Elisa had expected something rank, the stench of a war camp maybe, or the acrid bite of forges working overtime to arm a territory perpetually braced for conflict. But the smell that drifted over the ridge on the morning of the third day was something she couldn't place at first. Sweet and sharp at the same time, like crushed herbs left too long in boiling water. Medicinal. Desperate. Underneath that, blood. Not fresh. Old blood. The kind that had seeped into stone and stayed there so long it had become part of the architecture. "That's the palace," Dorothy said beside her. She'd been sitting with her eyes closed for the last hour, conserving energy the way someone does who knows exactly what's coming and has decided to meet it rested rather than afraid. Now she opened her eyes and looked toward the horizon with the flat expression of a woman returning to a place she'd hoped never to see again. "You've been here before," Elisa said. It wasn't a question. "Twice. First time I was 26. They laid me beside him for 3 nights. Each morning I woke up with a little less." Dorothy held up her hands. They were veined and spotted, the hands of a woman 20 years older than her face suggested. "He took 8 years off me that first time. 8 years just gone. Like someone reached into my body and pulled out a decade of living." "And the second time?" "Second time his wolf rejected me before the first night was done, spat me out like bad meat." She smiled, and it was the most joyless expression Elisa had ever seen on a human face. "That was worse. Being drained means you have something worth taking. Being rejected means you're not even good enough to die for a king." The wagon crested the ridge, and the palace came into view. Elisa forgot to breathe. It was enormous. Not in the way of human castles she'd heard described in stories, squat, functional, built to survive sieges. This was something else entirely. The palace rose from the landscape like a creature mid-emergence, its towers and walls constructed from pale stone that caught the morning light and held it, glowing faintly gold. It sprawled across a wide plateau, overlooking a river valley, and from this distance, with the sun behind it and the mist still clinging to the lower walls, it looked like something out of the myths her mother used to tell, back when her mother still told her things. But as the convoy descended and the distance shrank, the decay revealed itself. The outer walls were cracked, not from assault, from neglect. Vines had taken root in the mortar and pulled the stones apart slowly, patiently, the way grief pulls apart a person. The gates, which must have once been magnificent, wrought iron worked into the shapes of wolves in mid-leap, were tarnished and listing on their hinges. One gate stood permanently open, its bottom edge buried in dirt that had accumulated over years of nobody caring enough to sweep it clear. The gardens beyond the gates told the same story. Elisa could see that they'd been designed with extraordinary care. Geometric beds, fountain basins, pathways laid in intricate mosaic. But the beds were overgrown, the fountains dry, the mosaic pathways cracked and pushed apart by roots that had decided to reclaim what was theirs. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like watching a painting dissolve in rain. You could see what it had been. You could see what it was becoming. The space between those two things was the saddest part. Servants appeared as the convoy entered the main courtyard. They moved with a precision that struck Elisa immediately. Quick, coordinated, silent. Not a word exchanged, not a glance wasted. They unloaded the grain, the pelts, the iron, the salted fish with the efficiency of people who had done this so many times, their bodies no longer required instruction from their minds. None of them looked at the tributes, not out of cruelty, out of practice. Elisa understood this instinctively. These were people who had learned that looking at the faces of sacrifices made it harder to do their jobs, and their jobs were the only things keeping them alive in a palace that was slowly eating itself. A woman in a gray linen dress approached the wagon. She was perhaps 50, with steel-colored hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to be holding her face together. Her eyes were the color of winter river water, clear, cold, purposeful. She carried a ledger nearly identical to the bookkeeper's from Elisa's village, and when she spoke, her voice had the quality of a door being closed firmly. "Tributes will follow me. Single file. No speaking. No stopping." They followed. Through the courtyard, past the dead fountains, under an archway carved with wolves so old their features had been softened to suggestions by centuries of wind. Into the palace itself, where the light shifted from gold to the pale blue-white of stone corridors lit by narrow windows, and the smell intensified, that medicinal sharpness, that old blood, and underneath it, something Elisa could only describe as the scent of a body fighting to stay alive, the metabolic desperation of a system operating far beyond its limits. They descended, not into a dungeon. Elisa had been bracing for darkness, for iron bars and dripping water. Instead, they were led into a lower level that was aggressively, almost violently clean. White stone floors, scrubbed until they shone, white walls, white linen curtains that billowed slightly in some unseen draft, giving the space the feeling of breathing. Surgical trays lined the walls, gleaming instruments arranged with obsessive order. The air tasted of alcohol and something herbal, astringent, designed to sterilize. This was a hospital, or a laboratory, or something between the two that hadn't been named, because naming it would require admitting what happened here. "Preparation," the woman in gray said, and gestured to a row of doors. "One per room. You will be bathed, examined, and assessed. Those selected for the offering will be taken to the king's chambers tonight. Those not selected will be held until alternative arrangements are made." She said alternative arrangements the way Elisa's father had shrugged when asked about her fertility, with the practiced emptiness of someone describing a process they chose not to think about too carefully. Elisa was taken to the third room. It was small, white, and contained exactly 3 things: A metal tub filled with steaming water, a folded linen shift on a wooden stool, and a woman who introduced herself as Janine. Janine Sims was perhaps 30, with steady hands and a face designed for professional neutrality. She instructed Elisa to undress without ceremony or apology, the way a carpenter instructs you to hold a board, because the task requires it, not because anyone is interested in your comfort. Elisa undressed. She'd expected humiliation, but what she got was somehow worse: indifference. Janine examined her body with clinical precision, checking her teeth, her eyes, the condition of her skin, the strength of her grip, the speed of her reflexes. She pressed her fingers to Elisa's throat to check her pulse, held her wrist, tapped her knees. She noted everything in a small leather journal without speaking. "Into the bath," Janine said. The water was hot enough to sting. It smelled of rosemary and something sharper, eucalyptus maybe. Janine scrubbed her with a coarse cloth that took off dirt and dead skin with equal efficiency, and Elisa sat in the metal tub and let it happen, and understood with sudden, absolute clarity what this room was for. This was where they cleaned the offering before presenting it to the king. You wash a sacrifice the same way you wash a blade, not out of care for the object, but out of respect for the ceremony. She was not a person in this room. She was a material. They came for her 2 hours later. Not all the tributes, just her. She'd been sitting on the wooden stool in the linen shift, her hair still damp, her skin raw and tingling from the scrubbing, when the door opened and the woman in gray reappeared with a man Elisa hadn't seen before. He was tall, gaunt in the way of someone who'd once been powerfully built and had been reduced by something: illness, grief, or the specific exhaustion of holding a crumbling institution together with nothing but will. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. "This one?" he said, looking at her the way the bookkeeper had looked at her in her father's doorway, with assessment, not curiosity. "Healer Nathaniel says she'll do," the woman in gray replied. "No wolf, no pack bond to interfere with the transfer. Young enough to sustain at least 2 nights, possibly 3. "At least 2, the man repeated, and something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt before professionalism extinguished it. "Bring her." They walked. Down another corridor, then another, descending further into the palace's interior. The medicinal smell grew stronger with each step, and Elisa felt a new sensation building in her body, a pulling. Not like the echo of Sammy's fear in the convoy wagon. This was deeper, heavier, like a hook had been set somewhere behind her breastbone, and something in the depths of this palace was reeling it in, slowly, steadily, with the patient inevitability of a tide. She stopped walking. The woman in gray turned. "Move." "Something's wrong," Elisa said, not to them, to herself, because the pulling was intensifying, and with it came pain, not hers, but flooding into her with the force of a river breaking through a dam. Her knees weakened, her vision blurred at the edges. She could feel wounds that didn't exist on her body, a gash across her ribs that burned like it had been made with a heated blade, a deep, rotting ache in her left shoulder, as if something had been driven into the joint and left there to fester. And over her heart, the worst of it, a pressure so immense, it felt like her chest was being crushed from the inside, a wound so old and so deep it had become part of the architecture of whoever carried it. She gasped, pressed both hands to her sternum. "What's wrong with her?" the woman in gray asked sharply. The gaunt man was staring at Eliza with an expression she couldn't read. He'd gone very still, the way wolves go still when they sense something they don't understand. "She's feeling him," he said quietly. "She's feeling the king, and we're still 2 floors away." He turned to the woman in gray, and now his expression was unmistakable. It was fear. "In 30 years of managing tributes," he said, "I have never seen one respond to the king's wounds before entering his chambers. Not once." He looked back at Eliza, who was standing in the white corridor with her hands pressed to a heart that was breaking under the weight of someone else's pain, her eyes wide and wet, her body shaking with the effort of containing a suffering that wasn't hers. "What are you?" he asked. Eliza didn't answer. She couldn't. The pain was a living thing inside her now, and it was pulling her forward, pulling her down toward whatever was dying in the depths of this beautiful, rotting palace. Not because she wanted to go, not because she chose to, because whatever was down there was calling to the broken thing inside her, and the broken thing inside her was answering. They led her down the final staircase, through a door reinforced with iron, into a chamber that smelled like battlefield medicine and sorrow. And she saw him. The Alpha King lay in a bed that seemed to dwarf even his massive frame. He was, or had been, enormous. Broad-shouldered, thick-armed, built the way mountains are built, with the dense, unapologetic physicality of a body designed for dominance. But the body in that bed was at war with itself. His skin was a map of wounds, dozens of them, crisscrossing his torso, his arms, his throat. Not scars, open wounds, gashes that wept slowly, steadily, as if they'd been made minutes ago. Though the oldest of them, the one over his heart, a ragged, blackened tear in his flesh, looked like it had been there for decades. His wolf moved under his skin like something trapped in ice. She could see it, rippling along his arms, pressing against his ribs, surging toward the surface and falling back, trying to shift, failing, over and over, in a cycle that must have been agony. His eyes were closed, his breathing was shallow and irregular, the breathing of a man whose body had forgotten how to do it automatically and was forcing each breath through conscious effort. The healer, Nathaniel, she assumed, was already in the room. An older man with thick spectacles and hands that trembled slightly, standing beside the bed with the weary posture of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for longer than he wanted to remember. He looked at Elisa, looked at the gaunt man, raised his eyebrows. "She felt him from the second floor," the gaunt man said. Nathaniel's eyebrows climbed higher. He approached Elisa slowly, the way you approach an animal you're not sure is dangerous. "Child," he said, "what do you feel right now?" Elisa looked at the Alpha King, at the wounds that wouldn't close, at the wolf that couldn't surface, at the face, strong-jawed, brutal even in unconsciousness, of a man who was being eaten alive by something no one could see. She felt everything. Every wound, every failure of his body to heal itself, the decades of accumulated pain, layered so thick it had its own geography, mountains and valleys of suffering, each one a story she hadn't been told, but could read in the language of her own nerve endings. "Everything," she said. "I feel everything." Nathaniel removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on. His hands were shaking harder now, but his voice, when he spoke, was very steady. "Lie beside him," he said. Elisa looked at the bed, at the broken king, at the wounds that called to the part of her that everyone had called defective. She climbed onto the bed, and the moment her skin touched his, the world went white. Chapter 3. What happened when she touched him? Pain has a color. Elisa had never known that before. She'd felt pain her entire life, her own and the borrowed, bleeding echoes of everyone else's, but she'd always experienced it as sensation, pressure, temperature, the blunt grammar of nerve endings speaking in the only language they knew. But the Alpha King's pain had color. The moment her skin made contact with his, the preparation chamber vanished. The white walls, the medicinal smell, the healer's trembling hands, the gaunt man's frightened face, all of it dissolved like salt in hot water, and what replaced it was a landscape. Red. Everywhere red. Not the red of blood, she knew that color intimately. This was deeper, older, the red of embers buried under ash for years, still burning, still consuming, long after everyone assumed the fire had died. It stretched in every direction, a vast, scorched plain where nothing grew, where the ground itself seemed to pulse with a slow, agonized heartbeat. She was inside him, Not metaphorically, not spiritually. She was standing inside the geography of the Alpha King's suffering, and it was a continent. The first wound hit her like a fist. It came from her left, a gash across the ribs, searing and immediate. She screamed and looked down at her own body, expecting to see the cut, expecting blood. There was nothing. Her skin was unmarked, but the pain was absolute, total, as if someone had drawn a heated blade across her side and left it there, pressing. Then the second wound, the shoulder, that deep, rotting ache she'd felt in the corridor, but magnified 1,000-fold. Something had been driven into the joint, not a blade, something alive. She could feel it burrowing, feeding, sending tendrils of black corruption outward through the muscle and bone. Then the third, the fourth, the seventh, the 12th. They came in waves. 7th, the 12th. They came in waves. Years of accumulated damage compressed into seconds. Each wound carried its own history, its own story, and she lived them all simultaneously. An ambush in a mountain pass. She felt the arrows, 3 of them, punching through armor and flesh. A betrayal at a council table. She felt the cursed blade enter his back, felt the shock and the specific, devastating sting of being hurt by someone you trusted. A battle at a river crossing. She felt the weight of bodies pressing against her, the snap of bone, the taste of blood in a mouth that wasn't hers. She was drowning in his history, and every chapter was written in pain. Somewhere far away, miles away it felt like, though she knew it was only the width of a bed, she could hear voices. Nathaniel's, sharp with alarm, the gaunt man's, edged with something between terror and wonder. And underneath those voices, a sound that took her a moment to identify because she'd never heard anything like it. A wolf. Howling. Not outside the palace, inside the king's body. His wolf was howling, a raw, desperate animal sound that vibrated through the red landscape like an earthquake. It was the sound of something that had been caged so long it had forgotten what freedom felt like but hadn't stopped wanting it, hadn't stopped throwing itself against the bars. The howl pulled at something inside Elisa, something deep and unnamed and so fundamental to her makeup that she'd never thought to question it, the same way you don't question your own heartbeat until it stops. Her body responded. She didn't choose it. She didn't understand it. She simply felt the mechanism engage, some ancient, buried machinery inside her that had been waiting, rusting, forgotten, for exactly this moment. The king's wounds were pouring into the red landscape like water from a broken dam, and her body began to drink. She absorbed. The gash across his ribs, she took it, felt it transfer from his body to hers, a searing migration of damage that left her gasping. But as it entered her, something happened that she hadn't expected. The wound didn't just sit inside her, it moved through her. It passed through whatever strange, porous thing she was and came out the other side, diminished, processed, like her body was a filter, and the pain that entered raw and screaming emerged as something quieter, not gone, but survivable. She took the shoulder wound, the arrow punctures, the battle damage. She took them one by one, and each time the transfer happened, she heard the king's wolf howl again, but differently now. Less desperate, more surprised, as if the animal had felt its cage loosen by a single bar and couldn't believe it. The wound over his heart was last. She'd been avoiding it. Not consciously, her body had been working through the damage in a kind of triage, starting with the wounds it could process and leaving the worst for last, the way you save the deepest splinter for when you've already steeled yourself with smaller extractions. But now, there was nothing left except the heart wound, and it was a void, not a wound, an absence, a place where something had been torn out so violently and so long ago that the body had never figured out how to close around the loss. She could see it in the red landscape, a black crater at the center of everything, pulsing with a slow, sick rhythm that was almost, but not quite a heartbeat. The cursed blade, the one his beta had driven into his back, it had gone through and exited through his chest, and the curse it carried had lodged itself in the wound like a seed in soil, growing, feeding, preventing the flesh from ever closing. Elisa approached the crater. Each step was harder than the last. The gravity of the wound pulled at her, and the pain radiating from it was beyond anything she'd experienced. This wasn't just physical damage. This was emotional. This was the place where the king kept his betrayal, his loneliness, his fury at a body that had turned against him, his grief for a sister who died in the same attack that cursed him. Every unspoken feeling he'd ever buried had accumulated here, compacted into a density of suffering that was almost geological. She reached the edge, looked down. Something looked back, black, writhing, alive. She recoiled, and in the physical world, in the chamber where her body lay beside the king's, she convulsed. Her back arched off the bed, blood appeared on her skin, seeping from wounds that had no source, no cut, no entry point. It simply emerged, as if her body had decided to manifest the damage it was absorbing in the only language the physical world understood. Nathaniel shouted something. Hands grabbed at her, trying to pull her away from the king, trying to break the contact. But the moment their fingers touched her skin, the healers recoiled. Her body was burning. Not with fever, with transfer. She was a conduit, and the current running through her would injure anyone who interfered. "Don't touch her!" Nathaniel's voice, thin and terrified. "The transfer, this has never—" She couldn't hear the rest. She was back in the landscape, back at the edge of the crater, and the black thing inside it was moving, rising, pressing against the walls of the wound like something trying to be born. She didn't have the strength to take this one. She knew it with the certainty of a body that has reached its absolute limit, the way a runner knows the exact moment their legs will fail, not because they decide to stop, but because the muscle simply has nothing left to give. But she reached toward it anyway, not with power, not with any ability she could name or understand. She reached with the only thing she had, the thing that had been her curse and her defect and her defining failure for 22 years. She reached with her capacity to feel. She opened herself to the king's deepest wound, and she said, not out loud, not in words, but in the language of a body that had spent a lifetime translating other people's pain into something she could carry, "I know. I know. I know how this feels." The crater shuddered. The black thing inside it recoiled, not because she'd hurt it, but because it didn't understand her. It was a creature of destruction, designed to feed on resistance, on the body's desperate attempts to heal and fight and reject. It fed on struggle. And Elisa wasn't struggling. She was accepting. She was standing at the edge of someone else's worst moment and saying, with her whole broken, exhausted body, "I'm not afraid of your pain. I've been living in pain my entire life. Yours is just louder." She couldn't take the heart wound. Not tonight. Not yet. She didn't have enough left. But she touched it. Just the edge. Just enough to tell the wound, and the thing living inside it, that she was here. That she would be back. And then the red landscape collapsed, and she was in the chamber again, lying on a bed soaked with blood that had come from nowhere, shaking so hard her teeth were chattering, staring at a ceiling that swam and blurred above her. Dawn. Gray light. The smell of blood and rosemary and sweat. Her body felt like it had been disassembled and put back together by someone working from a rough sketch. Everything was in approximately the right place, but nothing fit quite the way it had before. She turned her head. It took an extraordinary amount of effort, like turning a rusted hinge. The king was beside her, still in the bed, still unconscious, but different. His breathing had changed. Where before it had been shallow, labored, forced, each inhale a negotiation with a body that had forgotten how to sustain itself, now it was deeper, steadier, the rhythm of genuine sleep rather than the stuttering half-death he'd been trapped in. And his wounds. Elisa blinked, focused, looked again. The gash across his ribs was closed, not healed. The skin was still raw and new, the kind of pink that meant the tissue underneath was fragile, but closed, sealed. For the first time in what the healers said had been 18 years, the wound was no longer bleeding. The shoulder wound had shrunk. The arrow punctures were gone entirely, just faint discolorations on his skin where they'd been, like shadows of injuries rather than the injuries themselves. The heart wound remained, still open, still weeping that slow, dark blood. But even it looked different, the edges less ragged, the blackness less absolute, as if something had touched it and left a faint fingerprint of light. She looked down at her own body. The linen shift was ruined, soaked through with blood that had seeped from marks that now decorated her skin like a grotesque embroidery, lines and shapes that corresponded exactly to the wounds she'd absorbed. A red stripe across her ribs, a dark bruise blooming on her shoulder, faint circular marks on her arms where the arrow wounds had transferred, and over her heart, a tender, aching rawness that pulsed with a rhythm that wasn't entirely hers. She was marked. She was his map of damage, rendered on her own skin. The door opened. Nathaniel entered, followed by the gaunt man and 2 assistants carrying trays of medical supplies. The healer's face was ashen. He looked like a man who had stayed up all night watching the impossible happen and had aged a decade in the process. He approached the bed, checked the king's pulse, checked his breathing, examined the closed rib wound with fingers that had gone from trembling to absolutely still, the steadiness of someone too shocked to shake. Then he looked at Elisa. "In 34 years," he said, "I have attended 112 tributes through the king's ritual. Every single one of them was drained. The king's wolf takes life force from the offering. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. The tribute weakens. The king strengthens. Temporarily. Briefly. Never enough." He paused, removed his spectacles. His eyes, without them, looked naked and old. "You are the first tribute in 34 years whose body did not give life to the king. Your body took his wounds instead. You absorbed them. You processed them. I don't have a word for what you did because it has never happened before in the recorded history of this ritual." He put his spectacles back on, looked at the king, breathing deeply, sleeping genuinely, healing for the first time in 18 years. "What are you?" he asked her again. Elisa lay in the bloodied bed, wearing someone else's wounds, feeling the ghost of a wolf howling somewhere beneath a heart that wasn't hers, and gave him the only honest answer she had. "I don't know." From the bed beside her, a sound, low, rough, like gravel dragged across stone. The king opened his eyes. They were amber, not brown, not gold, amber. The color of fossilized light, of something ancient and alive and trapped in its own preservation. And they were focused, clear, present in a way that made every person in the room take an involuntary step back, because those eyes belonged to an alpha, and an alpha's gaze carries the weight of every wolf that has ever bent their neck to him. He looked at the ceiling, at Nathaniel, at the gaunt man, at the assistants, who had both gone pale and rigid. Then he looked at Elisa. She was lying beside him, wrecked and shaking, covered in his blood, wearing his wounds on her skin like a testament. She met his amber gaze and didn't look away, not because she was brave, but because she was too exhausted to perform the submission that instinct demanded. Something moved behind his eyes. Not gratitude, not pity. Recognition. The kind of recognition that happens when you've been screaming in a language no one speaks, and someone walks into the room and answers you, not with words, with the proof written on their own body that they heard every syllable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She had been inside his wounds. She had felt his wolf howling. She had touched the crater over his heart and said, "I know." He knew what she'd done. He'd felt her inside his pain, moving through it, taking it into herself the way a river takes in rain, not fighting the flood, but becoming wider to hold it. His eyes stayed on hers for a long, long moment. And then the Alpha King, the terror of the Northern Territories, the ruler whose name made border packs lower their voices, the man who had not been fully conscious in 18 years, did something that made Nathaniel drop his spectacles. He closed his eyes, and he exhaled. Long, slow, shuddering, the exhale of a body releasing a tension it had held so long it had forgotten the tension existed. It was the sound of a man who had been drowning for 2 decades and had just, for the first time, felt his head break the surface. Elisa lay beside him in the bloody bed and listened to him breathe and felt, through the strange, broken machinery of her defect, the faintest pulse of something she'd never felt from another person before. Not pain. Relief. Chapter 4. The Reluctant Tether. They tried to move her on the second day. Nathaniel had ordered it, not out of cruelty, but out of the clinical compulsion of a healer who needed to understand what he was dealing with before he could decide whether it was a miracle or a catastrophe. The assistants came with a stretcher. They lifted Elisa gently, carefully, with the cautious reverence of people handling something they suspected might be sacred, or might be explosive and couldn't tell the difference. They made it 14 steps down the corridor before the king started screaming. Not a human scream. The sound that ripped from his throat was animal, raw, guttural, the howl of a wolf being torn apart. His wounds, the ones Elisa had closed during the night, split open simultaneously. Blood sheeted across the white linens. The monitors, crude alchemical devices that measured his vital signs through shifts in temperature and pressure, went haywire. His wolf surged under his skin so violently that the bed frame cracked, and Elisa, 14 steps away on a stretcher, felt every wound reopen in her own body. She jackknifed, gasping, her hands flying to her ribs where the transferred gash had blazed back to life. "Bring her back!" Nathaniel's voice, high and cracking. "Bring her back now!" They carried her back. The moment she was within arm's reach of the king, the wounds began to close again, slowly, reluctantly, like mouths that had been forced open and were now settling back into silence. His breathing steadied. Her body stopped bleeding from places it had never been cut. 14 steps. That was the radius. Nathaniel measured it 3 more times over the following week, using progressively longer corridors and increasingly anxious assistance. The number held. 14 steps in any direction. Beyond that, the tether between them snapped taut, and his body began to unravel. She was not a prisoner, but she could not leave without killing him. They gave her the adjoining chamber. It had been a storage room. She could tell by the marks on the stone floor where shelves had stood, the faint rectangles of lighter color where crates had blocked the sun for years. But someone had cleaned it, furnished it with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small writing desk that wobbled slightly on uneven legs. A window, high and narrow, let in a slice of sky that changed color throughout the day, like a slow, silent conversation between the sun and the stone. She could hear him through the wall. Not words, he rarely spoke, but sounds. The creak of the bed when he shifted, the low, involuntary groans when a wound pulsed, the rhythm of his breathing, which she'd come to know as intimately as her own, steady in sleep, ragged when the pain spiked, and occasionally broken by long silences that terrified her until she realized he was simply holding his breath against a wave of agony, waiting for it to pass the way you wait for a storm to exhaust itself. She learned his pain schedule. Mornings were worst. Whatever the curse was, it fed during the night, and he woke each day diminished, his body having lost ground while he slept. The wounds that Elisa had closed would weep again, softly, not fully reopening but leaking at the seams like stitches under too much strain. By midday, her proximity would have pushed them back to closed. By evening, he was at his strongest, strong enough to sit upright, to eat, to speak in short, clipped sentences to the advisors who came and went with increasing frequency as word spread that the king was conscious again. She learned his sounds. She learned his rhythms. She learned the specific quality of silence that meant he was awake and in pain versus the silence that meant he was awake and thinking. The first was rigid, brittle, like a wire pulled too tight. The second was deeper, more elastic, the silence of a mind working through something complicated. On the fourth day, he spoke to her. She was sitting in the wooden chair, eating the broth that Janine Sims brought her 3 times a day, bland, nutritious, served without conversation, when his voice came through the wall. Low, rough with disuse, like a door being opened for the first time in years, the hinges grinding. "What's your name?" She set down the bowl, pressed her palm flat against the stone wall between them, as if she could feel the vibration of his voice in the rock. "Elisa," she said. "Elisa Russell." A pause, then, "The healers tell me you're the reason I can breathe without counting each inhale." "I don't know what I did." "I do." Another pause, longer this time. "I felt you. Inside the wounds. You moved through them like you'd been there before, like you knew the terrain." She closed her eyes. "I've always felt other people's pain. Since I was a child. My pack called it a defect." The silence that followed was the second kind, the thinking silence. It lasted so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "Your pack are fools." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat, absolute authority of a man who had been making final pronouncements his entire life and did not waste energy on niceties. But something in the way he said it, "Your pack are fools," landed inside Elisa's chest and settled there with a warmth she didn't know what to do with. Nobody had ever called her defect anything other than a weakness. Hearing it reframed as evidence of her pack's stupidity rather than her own failure was such a foreign concept that it took her a full minute to process it, the way it takes your eyes a moment to adjust when someone opens the curtains in a dark room. "What's your name?" she asked. The silence this time was different, surprised, as if no one had asked him that in a very long time, as if the title had consumed the man so completely that the question itself felt archaeological, digging for something buried under layers of Alpha King and Your Majesty and Sir. "Jonathan," he said. "Jonathan Blake." She pressed her palm harder against the wall and allowed herself to think something dangerous. He sounds lonely. The memories began on the 6th night. She was asleep, or thought she was, when the first one hit. Not gradually, not gently. It arrived with the force of a wave breaking against a cliff, and suddenly she wasn't in her narrow bed in the converted storage room. She was somewhere else entirely. A field. Late summer. The grass was waist-high and golden, and the wind moved through it in slow, heavy waves that made the whole landscape breathe. She was standing at the edge of a tree line, and she was not herself. She was taller, heavier. Her hands were enormous, scarred, calloused across the knuckles. She looked down at them and knew, with the disorienting certainty of a dream that insists on its own reality, that these were Jonathan Blake's hands. She was inside his memory. A woman was walking through the field toward her, young, maybe 17, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and a laugh that seemed to exist in a register slightly higher than the world around it, cutting through the heavy summer air like a bird's call. She was carrying something in her hands, wildflowers, Elisa realized, white ones. The woman held them up triumphantly, the way a child holds up a drawing they're proud of, and her face was so alive with joy that it hurt to look at. "Jonathan, look! I found the moon petals. Mother said they didn't bloom anymore, but look, look!" The emotion that flooded through Elisa was not hers. It was Jonathan's, preserved in his body's memory like a fossil in stone. Love. Uncomplicated, unguarded, the specific love of an older brother for a younger sister who still believed the world was a place where flowers bloomed when you went looking for them. The memory shifted, cracked, reassembled. Night now. The same field, but the grass was flattened, trampled, dark with something she didn't want to identify. Smoke in the air. The sound of wolves, not howling, snarling, fighting. The wet, percussive sounds of bodies colliding at speeds that broke bone. She was running. Jonathan was running. His hands were wet, blood, his and not his, and his wolf was surging inside him, trying to surface, trying to fight. But something was wrong. Something had been driven into his back. A blade. She could feel it. A cold, invasive presence between his shoulder blades, radiating a wrongness that spread outward through his body like ink in water. Ahead of him, in the trampled grass, the woman with the wildflowers. She wasn't laughing anymore. She wasn't anything anymore. Elisa screamed, or Jonathan screamed, or the boundary between them dissolved entirely, and the scream belonged to both of them. A shared vocalization of a grief so enormous it collapsed the memory like a building imploding, and she was back in her bed, in the storage room, drenched in sweat, with tears streaming down her face that she couldn't stop. She pressed her hands to her eyes and sobbed, not for herself, for him, for the woman in the field who'd been so happy about the flowers, and for the version of Jonathan Blake who'd loved her, and for the thing that had been destroyed in that field, along with the moon petals and the laughter, and the last time he'd felt anything uncomplicated. Through the wall, she heard him breathing, awake. He'd felt her inside the memory. She knew that, the way she knew the tether's radius was 14 steps. He'd felt her relive the worst night of his life, and now they were both lying in the dark, one wall apart, sharing a grief that neither of them had asked for, and neither of them could put down. Her name was Teresa, he said through the stone. Teresa Bass, my sister. She was 17. Elisa wiped her face. Her voice came out raw. The flowers, the white ones, moon petals, they bloom once every 3 years. She'd been looking for them all summer. A long, shattered silence. She found them the same night they came for us. Who? My beta, Wallace Paul. He'd been planning the coup for months, brought 200 wolves through the Eastern Pass while we were camped in the lowlands for the summer gathering. Teresa was... His voice stopped. Not because he chose to stop, because his throat closed around the words and refused to let them pass. Elisa pressed both palms to the wall. She could feel his grief through the stone, or through the tether, or through whatever broken, impossible thing connected them. It was vast, oceanic, the kind of grief that doesn't diminish with time but calcifies, becomes structural, so that the person carrying it eventually can't distinguish between the grief and themselves. You don't have to tell me, she whispered. You already know, he said. You were there. You saw. I know, but there's a difference between seeing a memory and being told a story. One is taken, the other is given. The silence that followed was the longest yet. She counted her own heartbeats, 12, 15, 20, before his voice came again, and this time it was different. Quieter, closer to the wall, as if he'd turned toward her and was speaking directly into the stone. She was trying to reach me when they caught her. She shifted. Her wolf was small, silver, barely a year into its first form, and she ran toward me across the field. Wallace's wolves intercepted her. 3 of them. She didn't... Another stop. Another silence that contained an entire world of pain. She didn't have a chance. Elisa was crying again, silently this time. Not performative grief. The real thing. The helpless, leaking kind that happens when your body encounters a sadness too large for the containers you've built to hold it. The blade Wallace put in my back was cursed. Old magic, the kind that doesn't just wound. It plants something. A fragment of the attacker's wolf, designed to feed on the host from within. It's been inside me for 23 years. Every healer, every ritual, every tribute. They've been treating the symptoms, the wounds, the bleeding. Nobody's been able to reach the thing that's actually killing me. I saw it, Elisa said. During the first night, in the wound over your heart, something black, alive. Silence. Then, very quietly, you saw it and you didn't run. I couldn't run. I was inside your... You could have pulled back. Nathaniel said the tether works both ways. You can push yourself out of the connection if you fight it hard enough. Other tributes have. The moment the king's wolf starts draining them, they resist, and the ritual takes its course. He paused. You didn't resist. You went deeper. She thought about this. About the red landscape, the crater, the black thing coiled inside the wound over his heart. "I wasn't brave," she said. I recognized it. The pain. It felt like something I already knew." Through the wall, she heard him exhale, that long, shuddering release she'd heard once before, in the chamber, when he'd opened his eyes for the first time and seen her lying beside him covered in his blood. "Elisa Russell," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a word he was learning for the first time, feeling out the shape of it. "What does it cost you?" "Carrying other people's pain." She looked down at her hands, at the faint marks on her skin, his wounds mapped onto her body, at the gray strand she'd noticed in her hair that morning, just one, threading through the dark like a wire. "Everything," she said. "It costs everything." He didn't respond, but through the wall, through the stone, through the tether that bound them in a radius of 14 steps, she felt something shift in him. Not a wound closing, something else, something opening. It felt, impossibly, like the beginning of care. And Elisa pressed her forehead to the cold wall and let herself feel it. This small, dangerous, entirely new sensation. And knew, with the certainty of a body that had spent a lifetime translating pain, that this one was going to hurt worse than all the others combined. Because hope, she'd learned, was just pain wearing a different dress. Chapter 5. The thing he saw in her hair. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for Elisa Russell to become indispensable to a kingdom that had considered her disposable. The rhythm had settled into something almost domestic, which made it more dangerous than anything that had come before. Danger you can see, a blade, a threat, a raised fist, is danger you can brace for. But the slow, insidious danger of becoming necessary to someone, of building a routine around shared damage, of waking each morning and reaching through the tether to check if he was still breathing, that was the kind of danger that dismantled you from the inside, brick by brick, so gently you didn't notice the walls were gone until the wind hit. Every morning she woke before dawn and pressed her palm to the wall, felt for him. His wounds would have wept during the night, the curse feeding in the dark hours, and the first thing her body did upon waking was reach through the tether and begin the slow work of pulling that fresh damage back into herself. She'd lie there, eyes closed, feeling the familiar burn of wounds that weren't hers migrating into her body, and by the time the sun cleared the narrow window, the worst of it would be over. His breathing would deepen, his wolf would settle, and she would sit up in bed with new marks on her skin and the taste of someone else's blood in the back of her throat. She didn't tell anyone about the gray. It had been one strand that first week. By the third week, it was a streak, a wide silver band running from her left temple back through her dark hair, as visible as a scar and impossible to hide. She'd tried, the first time she noticed it spreading, tucking it behind her ear and pulling her hair forward. But the strand was coarser than the rest, wiry and defiant, and it refused to be concealed. The tremor in her hands was harder to hide. It was subtle, a faint vibration in her fingers, most noticeable when she held something still, a cup of broth, a pen, the edge of a blanket. Her hands had been steady her whole life, steady enough to thread a needle in low light, and now they shook with a frequency that she recognized from her years of absorbing other people's damage. It was the tremor of a body operating beyond its capacity, a system running so hot that the cooling mechanisms had started to fail. Nathaniel noticed. Of course he did. The man had spent 3 decades watching bodies deteriorate, and he read the signs of decline the way most people read weather. He examined her during one of his daily visits, holding her wrist and counting her pulse, pressing his fingers to the glands in her throat, shining a small light into her eyes. "Your pulse is elevated," he said, consistently. "Your body is running a low-grade inflammation response. It's treating the absorbed wounds as a chronic infection, which means your immune system is in a state of permanent mobilization. That's not sustainable." He paused, looked at the gray streak. "How long has your hair been changing?" "A week? Maybe 2? "And the tremor?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Nathaniel sat down heavily in the wooden chair. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them, put them back on. the gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of buying time when he didn't want to say what he was about to say. "You're aging," he told her. "Not in years, in wear. Your body is processing the king's damage faster than it can regenerate its own cells. At the current rate, you're losing approximately 2 years of physical vitality for every month of healing. If you continue—" "How long?" He looked at her. Behind the spectacles, his eyes were the particular kind of tired that comes from watching people make choices he couldn't save them from. 6 months, perhaps 8. After that, your body will no longer be able to sustain the transfers. Your organs will begin to fail. Your heart first, probably. It's bearing the largest share of the sympathetic load." He leaned forward. "Elisa, you must understand what I'm telling you. If you continue healing the king at this rate, you will die before he's fully cured." She understood. She understood with the absolute clarity of a body that had always known, on some cellular level, that the thing that made her different would eventually be the thing that consumed her. The defect had a cost. It had always had a cost. The only difference now was that someone was finally keeping track. "Does he know?" she asked. "No. And I would advise, don't tell him." Nathaniel stared at her. "Elisa, if he knows, he'll stop the healing, he'll pull away, and the curse will eat him alive. And if he doesn't know, the healing will eat you alive." She met his gaze, held it, and in that moment, Nathaniel saw something in her eyes that he would later describe to the gaunt man, whose name, Elisa had finally learned, was Solomon Hess, as the most terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed in a patient. Acceptance. Not resignation, not defeat. Acceptance. The calm, lucid, unwavering decision of a person who has calculated the cost and chosen to pay it, not because they don't value their own life, but because they've found something they value more. "Don't tell him," she said again. Nathaniel didn't tell him. He should have. The alpha daughter arrived on a Tuesday. Elisa heard the commotion from her chamber, the sudden increase in movement through the corridors, the clipped voices of palace staff who'd been jolted out of their decay-accustomed routines by something that required urgency. She pressed her palm to the wall, checking Jonathan. His breathing was steady, his wounds quiet, and then went to the narrow window and looked down into the courtyard. The convoy was nothing like the one that had brought her. Where her convoy had been 3 battered wagons and a handful of guards, this one was a procession, 30 wolves in formation, flanking a carriage of polished dark wood with iron fittings that caught the sun. Banners, deep blue and silver, the colors of the Southern Reach, flew from poles mounted on the lead riders' saddles. Everything about it screamed wealth, power, and the specific confidence of a pack that had never been reduced to sending tributes. The woman who stepped out of the carriage made the courtyard feel smaller. She was tall, nearly as tall as Jonathan, which meant she towered over Elisa by a full head. Her hair was black and fell in a heavy curtain past her shoulders, and she moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a wolf who shifted so often that her human body had absorbed the animal's economy of motion. Everything about her was deliberate. The way she placed her feet, the way her eyes swept the courtyard, cataloging the decay, the cracked walls, the dead fountains, with an expression that balanced assessment and disdain so precisely that neither could be called dominant. She was beautiful in the way that weapons are beautiful, elegant, purposeful, and designed to make you aware of your own vulnerability. Her name, Elisa would learn later that day from Janine Sims, was Miranda Simon, daughter of the Southern Reach Alpha, undefeated in territorial combat, unmated by choice, not circumstance, and she had come to the palace for one reason: to be presented to Jonathan Blake as a potential mate. "The court's been negotiating this for months," Janine told her, delivering the evening broth with her usual clinical detachment. "Even before you arrived. The king needs an heir. The territory needs an alliance. The Southern Reach has the strongest bloodline outside the capital. Miranda Simon is—" She paused, and for the first time, something approaching opinion crossed her professionally neutral face. "She is what a queen is supposed to look like." Elisa took the broth, wrapped her trembling hands around the warm bowl, and didn't ask the question that was forming in her chest like a bruise. And what do I look like? The thing that keeps him breathing but isn't supposed to be seen. She didn't ask. She already knew the answer. She met Miranda Simon 3 days later, by accident. Elisa had been walking the corridor outside Jonathan's chamber. The 14-step radius had become her world. A small orbit she traced and retraced until she knew every crack in the stone, every variation in the mortar, every place where the light from the high windows fell at different angles depending on the hour. When she turned a corner and almost collided with a wall of dark hair and the sharp cedar and iron scent of a dominant she-wolf. Miranda looked down at her, not with hostility, with curiosity, the dispassionate, feline curiosity of a predator encountering a species it hasn't seen before and trying to determine its place in the food chain. "You're the tribute," Miranda said, not a question. "Elisa, I know your name." Miranda's eyes moved over her, the gray streak, the trembling hands, the faint marks on her skin where Jonathan's wounds had left their map. "I also know what you're doing for the king. The healers briefed me." Elisa waited. She'd been bracing for cruelty, the kind of dismissal she'd experienced her entire life from people who looked at her and saw nothing worth respecting. But Miranda Simon didn't dismiss her. She studied her. The way a general studies a battlefield, not for what's there, but for what it means. "You're killing yourself," Miranda said. "The gray, the tremor. You're absorbing more than your body can process. The healers are monitoring. The healers are watching you die on a schedule and calling it treatment." Miranda's voice was flat, factual, the voice of someone who dealt exclusively in realities and had no patience for the comfortable fictions people built around them. "I've seen what the king's curse does to tributes. It eats them. You're lasting longer than most, but the math is the same. The question is whether you'll be used up before he's healed or after." The words should have been cruel. They weren't. They were honest in the specific, unsentimental way that only someone who'd never been powerless could afford to be honest, because Miranda Simon had never had to wrap the truth in softness to make it survivable. The truth had always been on her side. "Why are you telling me this?" Elisa asked. Miranda regarded her for a long moment. Then she said something that Elisa would turn over in her mind for weeks, examining it from every angle the way you examine a key when you're not sure what it opens. "Because he talks about you in his sleep. And a man who talks about someone in his sleep is not a man who's available for a political marriage. I need to know what I'm dealing with." She turned and walked away. Her footsteps were silent on the stone, the unconscious stealth of a wolf in human skin. Elisa stood in the corridor and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, as if the palace had shifted on its foundations. "He talks about you in his sleep." Jonathan found out on a Thursday. Not because Nathaniel told him, not because Elisa's careful concealment failed, because his wolf told him. The tether between them carried more than pain. Elisa had known this. She'd felt his memories, his grief, the shape of his loneliness. But she hadn't considered that the flow went both ways, that while she was absorbing his damage, his wolf was reading her, mapping her body through the connection with the same thoroughness that she mapped his wounds. His wolf felt her heart faltering, felt the subtle irregularity in her pulse that Nathaniel had been tracking with increasing alarm, felt the cellular fatigue that was aging her from the inside, quietly, steadily, the way rust eats iron. And his wolf told him the way wolves tell things, not in words, but in the sudden, visceral certainty of an animal that has identified a threat to something it has decided to protect. She was in her chamber when she heard him move. Not the small, careful movements of a man managing chronic pain, the sharp, urgent sounds of someone getting out of bed with a purpose that overrode physical limitation. She heard his feet hit the stone floor, heard him cross his chamber in 4 strides, heard the door between their rooms, the door they'd never opened, communicating only through the wall, slam inward. He filled the doorway. She hadn't seen him standing since the first night. In bed, diminished by pain and the horizontal posture of the chronically ill, he'd seemed reduced. Still large, still broad, still built on a scale that suggested his body had been designed for a world with bigger proportions, but reduced. Standing, he was something else entirely. Jonathan Blake was enormous, not just tall, constructed. His shoulders spanned the doorway. His arms, even wasted by years of illness, were thicker than her thighs. His chest, mapped with the still healing remnants of the wounds she'd absorbed, rose and fell with breaths that seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room. He was the physical argument for why his territory had remained unconquered for a century, because the man who led it was built like the answer to the question, what would happen if you made a wolf the size of a mountain and gave it a human face? But his amber eyes were not the eyes of a king or an alpha or a weapon. They were the eyes of a man who had just discovered that the person keeping him alive was dying to do it. How long? His voice was low, controlled, the control of someone holding something explosive and knowing that if they tightened their grip even slightly, it would detonate. Jonathan. How long? She looked at him, at this massive, broken, furious man standing in her doorway with his wounds still seeping and his wolf blazing behind his eyes, and his hands, his enormous, scarred hands, trembling. Not with weakness, with rage, with the specific, targeted fury of someone who has found something worth protecting and has just learned it's being destroyed. 6 months, she said. Maybe 8. He closed his eyes. His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. His wolf surged under his skin. She could see it, feel it through the tether, a massive, dark presence pressing against the boundaries of his human form, with a desperation that had nothing to do with the curse, and everything to do with the fact that its host had just been told the woman on the other side of the wall was being eaten alive by his pain. When he opened his eyes, the amber had darkened, almost black. The wolf was right behind them, looking out through his human face with an intensity that made Eliza's breath catch. Then it stops, he said. The healing, the transfers, it stops now. If it stops, I know what happens to me. He said it the way he said everything, with the absolute finality of a man who did not revisit decisions once made. The curse takes me in months, maybe a year if I'm lucky, but you live. Jonathan, you live. The word cracked through the room like a physical force, alpha command, the weight of his wolf behind it pressing against her chest and her shoulders, and her will with a power that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the fundamental hierarchy of wolves, which recognized no authority higher than an alpha's direct order. But Eliza had no wolf, and a command that relies on the submission of an inner animal has no purchase on a woman who's been empty where the wolf should be her entire life. She stood up, looked into the darkened amber eyes of the Alpha King, and didn't bend. You don't get to decide what my life is worth, she said quietly. No one does. Not my father, not my pack, not you. I spent 22 years being told I was nothing, a defect, a mistake, a mouth to feed with no return on the investment. And then I came here, and for the first time, the thing they called my weakness was the only thing that worked, the only thing that mattered. You don't get to take that from me. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A fracture, hairline thin, running through the bedrock of his certainty. She could feel it through the tether. Not a wound, a crack in his armor. The specific, devastating crack that forms when a man who has decided to die discovers that his death would destroy someone he didn't know he needed. He said nothing. He turned. He walked back through the door. That night, lying in her bed, listening to his breathing through the wall, Elisa felt something change. The tether was still there, 14 steps, absolute, but the flow through it had shifted. Normally, his wounds leaked into her like water finding cracks in a dam. Tonight, the dam had been reinforced. He was holding his pain back, clenching his body around the damage, refusing to let it pass through the tether to her. He was choosing to bleed rather than let her absorb another drop. She pressed her palm to the wall, felt his heart beating. Fast, strained, a muscle working overtime to sustain a body that was actively choosing to come apart. And she understood, with the devastating clarity of someone who speaks fluent pain, exactly what he was doing. He was dying for her. Wound by wound, breath by breath, he was letting the curse eat him alive so that she wouldn't lose another day. She closed her eyes. The tears came silently. Not for herself, for the terrible, beautiful, impossible man on the other side of the wall who had decided that her 6 months were worth more than his lifetime. And the wound over his heart, the one she'd touched on the first night, the one she'd promised to return to, began to bleed again. Chapter 6. The most beautiful cage ever built. He didn't banish her. That would have been easier. Banishment has a simplicity to it, a clean, brutal geometry. You are here, then you are gone. The door closes. The distance grows. The person who sent you away becomes a shrinking point on a horizon you're no longer allowed to approach, and eventually the horizon swallows them entirely, and you're left with nothing but the memory of the door closing and the sound it made. Jonathan Blake didn't close a door. He built her a house. It happened on a Sunday morning, 3 days after the confrontation in her doorway. Solomon Hess arrived at her chamber with 2 assistants and an expression that suggested he'd been given orders he disagreed with, but lacked the authority, or the courage, to refuse. "The king has arranged new quarters for you," Solomon said. His voice was carefully neutral, the diplomatic monotone of a man navigating between powers he couldn't control. A residence on the palace grounds, private, furnished, staffed. Elisa looked at him. How far from his chambers? Solomon didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "How far, Solomon?" "The Eastern Garden House, approximately 200 yards from the main palace." 200 yards, 14 times the radius of the tether, 14 times the distance at which his wounds ripped open, and his wolf screamed, and his body began the rapid, catastrophic process of coming apart. "He'll die," she said. "He's made arrangements," Solomon replied, and the way he said arrangements, with the particular heaviness of someone who understood exactly what the word contained, told her everything she needed to know. Jonathan Blake had looked at the math. On one side of the equation, his life, measured in months of increasing agony as the curse consumed what remained of his body. On the other side, her life, measured in decades she would never have if she continued absorbing his damage. He'd done what her father had done, the arithmetic. The cold, dispassionate calculation of which life was worth more, except her father had calculated that her life was worth less than a treaty obligation, and Jonathan had calculated that her life was worth more than his own. The cruelty of it was exquisite. The first person in her existence who had ever decided she was valuable had done so in the most devastating way possible, by removing himself from her reach so that her value could be preserved at the cost of his. She wanted to scream. She wanted to break something. She wanted to walk the 14 steps to his chamber and press her palm to his chest and dare him to push her away while she was touching the wound that had started everything. Instead, she packed her few belongings into a linen bag and followed Solomon Hess to the Eastern Garden House, because she had spent 22 years learning that the things you want most are the things you are least likely to be allowed to keep. The garden house was beautiful. She hated it immediately. It was a single-story structure of pale stone nestled among the overgrown gardens she'd first seen from the convoy wagon. Someone had cleared a path through the wild growth, recently, judging by the fresh-cut ends of the vines, but the gardens themselves remained untamed, pressing against the house's walls with the patient insistence of nature reclaiming what it considered its own. Inside, a bedroom with a real bed, wider and softer than anything she'd ever slept in. A sitting room with cushioned chairs and a fireplace that someone had already laid with wood. A small kitchen stocked with food, real food, not broth. Bread, cheese, dried fruit, a jar of honey that caught the light from the window and glowed amber. Amber, like his eyes. She set the honey jar face down so she wouldn't have to look at it. There was a writing desk, solid oak, with drawers that opened smoothly and a surface that didn't wobble. Paper, ink, pens with sharp, clean nibs. Someone had thought about what she might need and provided it with a thoroughness that suggested either genuine care or an extremely detailed briefing from someone who'd been paying attention to her habits. Jonathan. He'd noticed her staring at the wobbling desk in her old chamber. He'd seen her hands hover over it, wanting to write, lacking the tools. He'd noticed, and he'd remembered, and he'd furnished this beautiful prison with everything she needed except the only thing she wanted. Him. Alive. Within reach. Janine Sims appeared at the door that first afternoon. She'd been reassigned, apparently, no longer a preparation technician for tributes, but a personal attendant for the woman the court was calling, with varying degrees of respect and bewilderment, the king's healer. "You have a title now," Janine told her, setting a tray of food on the kitchen counter with her usual clinical efficiency. "The king signed the decree this morning. You are officially recognized as a protected ward of the crown. It comes with a stipend, quarters, which you have, and legal immunity from future tribute selection." She paused. "It also comes with a restriction. You are not permitted within the palace's inner compound without an escort approved by the king's personal guard." "An escort," Elisa repeated. "2 guards, stationed outside your door. They rotate in 12-hour shifts. They're not here to protect me." Janine's professional neutrality flickered. Just for a moment, a hairline fracture in the mask she wore like a second skin. "They're here to keep you from going to him." His words apparently were, "She will try. Don't let her." Elisa sat down on the bed. The mattress was soft. It yielded under her weight with a gentleness that felt like mockery. All this comfort, all this consideration, all this care, deployed in service of keeping her away from the person who needed her most. She will try. Don't let her. He knew her. 3 weeks of talking through a wall, and he knew her well enough to predict exactly what she'd do and to build a system designed to prevent it. He knew that she would walk through fire, through guards, through the ruins of her own body to reach him, because that was what she did. That was what she'd always done. She carried pain. She carried it voluntarily, compulsively, with the desperate dedication of someone who had found the only thing she was good at and would rather die doing it than live without purpose. He knew her, and he was using that knowledge to save her from herself. She hated him for it. She loved him for it. The two feelings occupied the same space in her chest, overlapping like wounds that shared an edge, and she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The first night alone was the worst. Not because of the silence. She'd lived in silence her whole life. The silence of a family that didn't see her, a pack that didn't count her. She knew how to exist in quiet the way fish know how to exist in water. It was the absence of him through the tether. At 14 steps, the tether had been a living thing, a constant, low-frequency hum of connection that carried his pain, his breathing, his heartbeat, the restless movements of his caged wolf. She'd grown accustomed to it the way you grow accustomed to the sound of rain on a roof. It became the background of her existence, so constant that she stopped noticing it until it stopped. At 200 yards, the tether didn't disappear. It thinned, stretched to a filament so fine she had to hold her breath and concentrate to feel it. But it was there. A thread of connection that vibrated, faintly, with the echoes of what was happening in his body. And what was happening in his body was a collapse. She felt the first wound reopen at midnight, a distant, muffled sensation, like hearing a scream through walls and floors and distance. The rib wound, the one she'd closed on the first night. It tore open in the dark, and she felt the echo of it in her own side. Not the searing transfer she'd experienced when they were close, but a ghostly imprint, a memory of pain rather than pain itself. By 2 a.m, the shoulder wound had followed. Then the old arrow punctures, one by one, like stitches being pulled from a seam. His body was unraveling in the order she'd repaired it, last in, first out, as if the curse was methodically undoing her work, erasing her from his flesh with the patient thoroughness of someone correcting a mistake. By dawn, she was sitting on the floor of her beautiful bedroom with her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly, the same motion she'd seen Sammy Lacey make in the tribute wagon, feeling the man 200 yards away bleed from wounds she'd given everything to close. And the heart wound, The one she'd only touched. The one that housed the black, writhing thing that was actually killing him. She could feel it through the filament, pulsing, expanding, feeding on the reopened wounds like a fire given fresh fuel. It was eating him faster now. Without her to absorb the damage, the curse had nothing to slow it down. Nathaniel's medicines, the ancient rituals, the healer's accumulated knowledge of 34 years, all of it was gauze against a hemorrhage, temporary, insufficient, buying days that cost weeks. She pressed her forehead to her knees and screamed into the fabric of her dress. The guards outside her door heard it. They didn't enter. Their orders were specific. Don't let her leave. Her suffering, apparently, was not part of their jurisdiction. Miranda Simon came to see her on the third day. She arrived without announcement, walking past the guards with the casual authority of someone who had never in her life been stopped by a person standing in a doorway. She entered the garden house, looked around with that characteristic assessing gaze, and sat down in one of the cushioned chairs as if she'd been invited. "You look terrible," she said. Elisa was sitting at the writing desk. She hadn't written anything. The paper was blank, the ink unused. She'd been staring at the wall, feeling Jonathan's pain through the filament, counting the wounds as they reopened. She'd lost count somewhere around the 15th hour. "He's dying," Elisa said. She didn't have the energy for preamble. "You know that." "I know that." Miranda crossed one long leg over the other. "The healers are trying everything. I've brought specialists from the Southern Reach, our best wolf-bone surgeons, our most experienced curse breakers. They've examined him." She paused. "They can't reach it. The thing inside the heart wound. They can see the damage it's causing, but they can't access the curse itself. It's embedded too deep, wrapped around his wolf like a parasite," Elisa said. "A fragment of Wallace Paul's wolf. I saw it." Miranda looked at her sharply. "You saw it? Inside the wound?" "On the first night, when I went in. It was at the bottom of, I don't know how to describe it, a crater, in the landscape of his pain. Black, alive, wrapped around his wolf's throat." She paused. "I touched the edge of it." "You touched it?" "Just the edge. I didn't have enough strength to go deeper. But I felt it. It's not just feeding on his body. It's feeding on his wolf specifically, keeping it trapped, preventing the shift, using the wolf's own healing energy as fuel. That's why the wounds won't close. Every time his wolf tries to heal him, the parasite intercepts the energy." Miranda was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had lost its usual flat authority. It was softer, tentative, the voice of a woman encountering the boundary of her own considerable competence. "Our curse breakers say the same thing. They can identify the parasite, but they can't reach it. They'd need to enter the wound the way you did, through the pain, through the internal landscape, and none of them have that ability. They're wolves. Their instinct is to fight damage, not absorb it." She looked at Elisa. "You're the only person we've encountered who can move through someone else's wounds as if they were physical spaces." "It's a defect," Elisa said. The word came out automatically, decades of conditioning, spoken in her father's voice, her mother's voice, every healer who'd ever examined her and found her wanting. "It's the only weapon that works against what's killing him," Miranda said. "That's not a defect. That's a siege engine." She stood, smoothed her traveling clothes with hands that had never trembled in their life. "I came here to tell you something. The court has scheduled a diplomatic gathering for the end of the month. Pack leaders from 6 territories. The official purpose is treaty renewal, but the real purpose is to present me as Jonathan's intended mate." Something twisted in Elisa's chest. Not jealousy. She didn't have the luxury of jealousy. Something colder. The recognition of a door closing in the distance, too far away to reach, on a room she'd been foolish enough to imagine herself inside. "He's agreed to this?" she asked. "He's agreed to attend, which, given that he can barely stand, is either an act of extraordinary willpower or extraordinary stupidity." Miranda walked to the door. stopped, turned back. For what it's worth, and I'm not in the habit of saying things for their emotional value, so you can trust this is purely strategic. I don't believe he wants to mate with me. I believe he agreed to the gathering because the court demanded it, and because he's decided to die, and dead men don't argue about wedding plans. She left. Her footsteps faded down the garden path. Elisa sat at the desk with blank paper and dry ink, and felt, through the filament, through the 200 yards of stone and garden and grief, Jonathan Blake's heart wound pulse with a rhythm that was getting slower. He was dying. Not quickly. The curse was patient, methodical, a predator that savored its kills. But steadily, inevitably, with the quiet certainty of a tide that would not be argued with. And she was sitting in a beautiful house with guards at the door and a title she'd never asked for, and a writing desk that didn't wobble, and she was going to feel every moment of it through the thread-thin tether that distance had weakened but could not, would not, sever. Because that was what she did. She carried other people's pain. She'd carried it her entire life, and no amount of stone and distance and well-intentioned cruelty was going to stop her from carrying his. She picked up the pen. Her trembling hand steadied, not because the tremor had stopped, but because purpose has a way of overriding the body's complaints when the mind has decided what matters. She began to write. Not a story, not an escape, a map of every wound she'd absorbed, every memory she'd lived, every corridor of his pain she'd walked. She was drawing the geography of his damage from memory, documenting every detail of the interior landscape, because somewhere in that map, in the shape of the crater, in the behavior of the parasite, in the way the curse fed and grew and sustained itself, there was an answer. There had to be. Because the alternative was sitting in a garden house and listening to the man she'd chosen die 200 yards away. And Elisa Russell had not survived 22 years of being worthless, only to discover her worth and lose it to a distance she wasn't allowed to cross. The pen moved, the map grew, and through the filament, through the dark, through the slow collapse of a body that had chosen death over draining her, she felt Jonathan Blake's wolf howl, soft, distant, desperate, like a lighthouse calling through fog to a ship it couldn't see, but refused to stop reaching for. Chapter 7. She wasn't supposed to come back. The map told her what the healers had missed. It took 11 days. 11 days of sitting at the oak desk, pen in her trembling hand, reconstructing the interior landscape of Jonathan Blake's pain from the memories seared into her body. She drew the red expanse, the scorched plain that stretched in every direction. She drew the individual wounds as she'd experienced them, each one a topographical feature, a landmark in the geography of his suffering. The rib wound was a ravine, jagged and deep. The shoulder wound was a sinkhole, its edges crumbling inward. The arrow punctures were small, precise craters arranged in the pattern of the ambush that had created them. And at the center, the heart wound, the crater. She drew it again and again, from every angle she could remember. The shape of it, the depth, the way the blackness inside it moved, not randomly, not chaotically, but with a pattern, a rhythm. She'd been too overwhelmed during the first night to notice, too consumed by the pain of the transfer to observe with any precision. But memory, stripped of the urgency of the moment, allowed her to see what experience had hidden. The parasite pulsed. Not like a heartbeat. Heartbeats are regular, mechanical, the body's metronome keeping time for a system that runs on rhythm. The parasite's pulse was irregular, syncopated. It surged and retreated on a schedule that seemed random until she laid her drawings side by side and traced the pattern across multiple pages and saw it. It was breathing, not with lungs, with the king's wolf. The parasite had wrapped itself around Jonathan's wolf so completely that it was using the animal's own life force as a respiratory system, inhaling the wolf's energy, metabolizing it, exhaling waste that manifested as the wounds that wouldn't close. Every time the wolf tried to heal its host, the parasite intercepted the healing energy, consumed it, and expelled the byproduct as fresh damage. The wolf wasn't failing to heal Jonathan. The wolf was healing him constantly. and the parasite was eating the healing before it could take effect. This was why no tribute had ever cured him. The ritual, laying a sacrifice beside the king, allowing his wolf to drain life force from the offering, was treating the wrong problem. It was giving the wolf more energy to heal with, which only gave the parasite more energy to consume. Every tribute, every healer, every ritual had been feeding the disease while trying to cure it. The solution wasn't more energy. The solution was removing the parasite. And the only way to remove the parasite was to enter the wound, navigate the landscape of his pain, find the thing wrapped around his wolf's throat, and extract it. Elisa stared at her map. At the crater she'd drawn 40 times from 40 angles. At the black shape coiled at its center, rendered in ink so dark it had bled through the paper. She knew what she had to do. She'd known probably since the first night, since she'd stood at the edge of that crater and touched the darkness and said, "I'll be back." The knowledge had been sitting in her body like a seed in frozen ground, waiting for the thaw of understanding to let it break the surface. She had to go back in, all the way in, past the edge she'd touched, down into the crater itself, into the place where the parasite lived and fed and kept Jonathan's wolf in chains. And she had to take the curse into herself. Not absorb it the way she absorbed wounds, processing the pain through her body like a filter, diminishing it, metabolizing it into something survivable. The parasite wasn't pain. It was a living thing, a fragment of Wallace Paul's wolf, implanted through the cursed blade, designed to feed and grow and kill. Taking it into herself wouldn't be like absorbing a wound. It would be like swallowing poison. She would become the new host, and the parasite would turn its hunger on her. But, and this was the part that had crystallized over 11 days of mapping and drawing and thinking, Elisa was not Jonathan. Jonathan's body fought the parasite. His wolf struggled against it, poured energy into healing, resisted with every fiber of its supernatural strength. And the parasite fed on that resistance. It was designed to feed on resistance. The struggle was its food source. Elisa didn't struggle. She had never struggled against pain. She didn't have a wolf to fight for her, didn't have supernatural healing to redirect, didn't have the alpha's instinct to dominate and overcome. What she had, the only thing she had, was a body that had spent 22 years learning to accept other people's suffering without resistance, to let it flow through her, to carry it without fighting it. The parasite would enter her. It would look for resistance to feed on. It would find none. And without resistance, without the struggle that sustained it, it would starve. She would become the environment in which it could not survive, not by overpowering it, by being inhospitable to it. A body so fluent in pain that the parasite's attempt to weaponize suffering would find no purchase, no leverage, no foothold. It was the most counterintuitive cure imaginable. The answer to the curse wasn't strength. It was surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of someone who understands pain so completely that they've stopped treating it as an enemy and started treating it as a language. Elisa looked at her hands. The tremor was worse. A visible vibration now, not just a subtle shaking. The gray streak in her hair had widened. In the small mirror above the kitchen basin, she could see faint lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. Her body was aging even without the active transfers, as if the damage she'd already absorbed was continuing to process, continuing to extract its toll. 6 months, Nathaniel had said, maybe 8. If she went back into Jonathan's wound and took the parasite, it might kill her tonight. If she didn't, it would kill him by winter. She folded the map carefully, placed it in the desk drawer, stood. Through the filament 200 yards away, she felt Jonathan's heart wound pulse, slow, heavy, fading. She had no more time for calculations. The diplomatic gathering was in its 3rd hour when the attack began. Elisa had been tracking the event through the muffled sounds that carried from the palace across the gardens. The distant murmur of voices, the occasional bark of formal laughter, the structured rhythms of a political performance playing out behind stone walls. 6 pack leaders from 6 territories gathered in the Great Hall under the pretense of treaty renewal, but really there to assess the Alpha King's condition with their own eyes and determine whether the most powerful territory on the continent was vulnerable enough to challenge. Jonathan was there. She could feel him through the filament, his pain spiking with the effort of standing, of speaking, of projecting the strength he no longer had. His wolf surged and receded beneath his skin in desperate, futile cycles, each surge weaker than the last. He was performing kingship with a body that was collapsing in real time, and every minute of the performance was costing him hours he didn't have. Miranda was there too. Elisa knew this not through the tether, but through Janine, who had become something adjacent to an ally over the past weeks, still professionally neutral, still clinically detached, but increasingly willing to share information with the quiet complicity of someone who had decided that the rules she served were less important than the person she was serving. Miranda Simon is positioned beside the king, Janine had told her that morning. The presentation will happen during the second hour. She'll be introduced as the intended mate. The Southern Reach delegates have brought contracts. Contracts. The word had landed in Elisa's chest like a stone in still water, sending rings of pain outward through her body. Contracts. As if love, or whatever this thing was between her and Jonathan, this tether of shared wounds and whispered confessions and a connection forged in the most intimate violation imaginable, could be rendered irrelevant by a document with signatures and seals. She'd been sitting in the garden house, feeling him fade, when the sound reached her. Not from the palace, from the walls. A deep, concussive boom, the sound of stone breaking under coordinated force. Then another, then a third, and this one was followed by something worse. The sound of wolves. Dozens of them. Not the controlled, disciplined wolves of the palace guard. These were feral, aggressive, their snarls carrying the specific pitch of animals that had been pushed past hierarchy and into pure, weaponized aggression. The guards at her door reacted immediately, both of them shifting in a cascade of cracking bone and tearing fabric, their human forms replaced in seconds by massive, combat-ready wolves that bolted toward the palace walls without a backward glance. Her door was unguarded. The realization hit her at the same moment as the next sound, an explosion from inside the palace itself. Not stone this time, something alchemical. A bright, acrid smell carried across the gardens on the wind, and through the filament, she felt Jonathan's pain spike to a level she hadn't experienced since the first night. Not his wounds. New damage. Something had happened in the Great Hall. She was running before she made the conscious decision to move. The garden path was a blur of overgrown hedges and cracked mosaic. She ran barefoot, her sandals abandoned by the door, the broken strap she'd never repaired flapping behind her, and the stones bit into her soles and she didn't care. 200 yards. She counted her steps without meaning to, her body so attuned to the radius of the tether that it measured distance automatically, and with each step she felt the filament thicken. At 150 yards, his pain sharpened. No longer a ghost echo, a presence. The rib wound, the shoulder wound, the arrow scars, all of them screaming through the connection with an intensity that made her stumble. At 100 yards, she could feel his wolf, thrashing, surging against the parasite's hold with a ferocity born of crisis. Not the slow, exhausted cycles she'd felt through the filament for the past 2 weeks, but the explosive, desperate fight of an animal that has detected an immediate threat to its host and is throwing everything it has at the cage that holds it. At 50 yards, she felt the new wound. Someone had driven something into Jonathan's side. Not a sword, something smaller, faster. An arrow. No, a bolt. Crossbow, aimed at close range, fired by someone who had been inside the Great Hall, inside the gathering. Someone who had been close enough to touch the king and had chosen this moment, this chaos, to strike. The bolt was cursed. She could feel the familiar wrongness of it, the same cold, invasive signature as the blade Wallace Paul had driven into Jonathan's back 23 years ago. The same magic, the same source. Wallace Paul was here, or his weapons were. She reached the palace entrance. The outer doors were shattered. blown inward by whatever alchemical charge had detonated. Smoke and dust choked the corridor. She could hear fighting, the wet, brutal sounds of wolf-on-wolf combat echoing through the stone halls, punctuated by human shouts and the clash of metal. She ran through the smoke, past overturned tables, past a body she didn't look at long enough to identify, past a cluster of palace guards in wolf form, locked in combat with attackers who fought with the unhinged savagery of wolves that had been promised something worth dying for. The great hall doors were open. What she saw inside stopped her in the doorway. The hall was a battlefield. Overturned banquet tables served as barricades. Pack leaders and their guards fought in a chaotic melee, the alliances of minutes ago dissolved by the primal reality of violence. Miranda Simon was in wolf form, a massive midnight black wolf that moved through the attackers with the lethal precision of someone who had trained for exactly this moment her entire life. She was magnificent and terrifying, a force of nature in fur, and she was fighting her way toward the center of the hall where... Jonathan. He was on the ground, not fallen, lowered. He'd gone to one knee, his hand pressed to his side where the crossbow bolt protruded, and his face was a mask of fury and pain and the specific incandescent rage of an alpha who has been wounded in his own hall in front of his own people. His wolf was pressing against his skin so hard she could see the outline of it, the massive, dark shape straining against the boundary between forms, fighting to surface, fighting to shift, fighting the parasite that held it caged. Around him, 3 wolves she didn't recognize, attackers, circling, patient. They knew what she knew, that the king couldn't shift, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything except kneel on the stone floor and bleed from a cursed bolt and rage against a body that refused to obey him. They were waiting for him to weaken enough to finish. Elisa walked into the great hall. She didn't run, she didn't scream. She walked with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who has made a decision so absolute that urgency has become irrelevant. The chaos of the battle parted around her, not because anyone moved aside for her, but because she moved through it with the strange, untouchable certainty of someone who has found the only path that matters and is walking it regardless of what happens on either side. She reached him. The 3 wolves turned toward her. One snarled, a warning, a threat, the sound of an animal evaluating a new variable and deciding it was negligible. She knelt beside Jonathan. His amber eyes found hers, and in them she saw what she'd seen on the first morning. Recognition, but layered now with something else. Something that looked like the last word of a sentence he'd been trying to say for weeks and had never found the breath for. "No," he said. His voice was wrecked, barely audible above the battle noise. "Elisa, no. I sent you away. She placed her hand over the wound on his heart, the old wound, the one that had started everything, the one that housed the black thing that was killing him. "I know," she said, "and I came back." His hand closed over hers, his fingers, massive, bloodied, trembling, wrapped around her hand with a grip that was simultaneously the gentlest and the most desperate thing she had ever felt. "It will kill you," he whispered. She looked into his eyes, amber and black and wolf and man and 23 years of pain and 3 weeks of something neither of them had dared to name. "Maybe," she said, "but I'd rather die inside your wounds than live outside them." She closed her eyes, pressed her palm flat against the crater over his heart, and went in. Chapter 8. The Wolf That Was Never Missing. The red landscape was dying. The last time she'd been here, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago, the scorched plain had pulsed with a slow, agonized heartbeat. Terrible, but alive. The pain that sustained this interior world had been immense, but it had been vital. The kind of suffering that exists only in bodies that are still fighting, still resisting, still pouring energy into the impossible project of survival. Now, the red was fading, bleeding out to gray at the edges, like a photograph left in the sun too long. The ground beneath her feet was soft, not the brittle, heat-cracked surface she remembered, but something yielding and fragile, as if the landscape itself was losing the structural integrity that pain had given it. Jonathan was dying. She could feel it in the architecture of his inner world, the walls thinning, the foundations settling, the whole vast geography of his suffering slowly, quietly deflating like lungs that had decided breathing was no longer worth the effort. She moved fast. The peripheral wounds were gone, not healed but collapsed. The ravine where the rib wound had been was now a shallow depression. The sinkhole of the shoulder wound had filled in with gray dust. The arrow craters were barely visible, smoothed over by the landscape's slow surrender. Without her to absorb the damage, the wounds had simply become part of the terrain, not closed, not open, just absorbed, subsumed. The body incorporating its own destruction because it no longer had the energy to distinguish between self and damage. The crater at the center was larger than she remembered. It had expanded, feeding on the reopened wounds, on the new cursed bolt, on 3 weeks of unfiltered deterioration. What had been a crater was now a chasm, its edges ragged and unstable, chunks of the landscape crumbling into it as she watched. The blackness inside it had grown too. She could see it from a distance, a roiling, pulsing mass that no longer stayed at the bottom of the crater, but surged upward, reaching for the edges, threatening to spill out and consume whatever remained of the red plain. And at the center of the blackness, barely visible, a shape. His wolf. She could see it, or sense it, or feel it, the boundaries between her senses having dissolved the moment she entered the wound. Jonathan's wolf was enormous, even in its diminished state, a massive dark presence wrapped in coils of the parasite's black tendrils, its amber eyes the only points of light in the entire chasm. It wasn't struggling anymore. The desperate surging she'd felt through the tether, the explosive fight-or-die energy of the Great Hall, it had exhausted itself. The wolf lay on its side, breathing in shallow, rapid pants, its eyes open but glazed with the particular distance of an animal that has accepted what is coming and is simply waiting for it to arrive. The parasite was wrapped around its throat, around its chest, around the massive, powerful legs that had once carried a king across battlefields. It squeezed with each pulse, tightening fractionally, and with each tightening, the wolf's breathing grew a little shallower, its amber eyes a little dimmer. Elisa descended into the crater. The blackness pressed against her immediately, not as pain but as pressure. Immense, suffocating, the weight of 23 years of curse bearing down on her body from every direction. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see. The darkness was so complete that for a moment she lost all sense of direction, all sense of self, and she was nothing, just a point of consciousness suspended in someone else's dying. She kept walking, downward, toward the wolf, toward the parasite, toward the thing that had been killing Jonathan Blake for 23 years and had never once encountered something it couldn't feed on. The parasite sensed her before she reached it. She felt its attention shift, a cold, predatory awareness turning in her direction, the way a snake turns toward warmth. It didn't have eyes. It didn't need them. It sensed her the way it sensed everything, through suffering. It could feel her pain, the accumulated damage in her body, the gray in her hair, the tremor in her hands, the years of vitality she'd spent absorbing wounds that weren't hers. She was a feast walking toward it, a body saturated with suffering, practically glowing with the energy the parasite had been designed to consume. It released one tendril from the wolf's throat, extended it toward her, testing, tasting. The tendril touched her arm and the cold was absolute. It bypassed her skin, bypassed her muscle, went straight to the marrow of her, to the deep, cellular place where her strange ability lived, where the porous, thin-skinned, defective thing that made her Elisa Russell resided. It latched on, began to feed, and Elisa did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She let it. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to fight, to resist, to push back against the invasion with whatever strength she had left. Her muscles locked, her jaw clenched, her heart hammered against her ribs with the panicked rhythm of an animal in a trap. But she didn't fight. She breathed. Slowly, deliberately, the way she'd breathed through every transfer, every absorbed wound, every night of carrying someone else's pain in a body that had never been designed for the weight, but had learned to bear it anyway. "I know you," she thought at the parasite. Not in words, in the language of her body, the language of acceptance, the vocabulary of a lifetime spent letting suffering pass through her without resistance. "I know what you are. You're pain. You're just pain. And I've been speaking your language since I was 6 years old." The parasite fed. It pulled at her, hard, greedy, with the frantic hunger of a thing that had been subsisting on the wolf's filtered energy and suddenly had access to a direct source. It drained her. She could feel herself diminishing, the gray in her hair spreading, the tremor in her hands deepening, the years of her life being consumed in real time like pages torn from a book. But the parasite was confused. It was designed to feed on resistance, on the struggle of a body fighting to reject it, on the immune response, the healing energy, the supernatural fury of a wolf battling an invader. That struggle was its fuel source. The friction between the curse and the host generated the energy the parasite consumed. Elisa wasn't struggling. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't generating friction. She was accepting. The pain flowed into her and she let it flow. She didn't clench around it, didn't push back, didn't try to metabolize or diminish or filter it. She simply opened, the way she'd opened on the first night, the way she'd opened her entire life, and let the suffering pass through her like wind through an open window. The parasite fed faster, harder, desperately, pulling at her with increasing frenzy, searching for the resistance it needed, the friction it craved. Finding nothing. Finding only an endless, quiet, unbearable acceptance that offered no purchase, no leverage, no foothold for a creature that survived on struggle. It was like trying to eat smoke, like trying to grip water, like trying to fight someone who refuses to raise their fists, not because they're weak, but because they've understood something about violence that the attacker hasn't, that the greatest power isn't the ability to strike, it's the ability to absorb a strike without breaking. The parasite began to shrink, not quickly, not dramatically. It contracted, fractionally at first, then faster, its tendrils loosening around the wolf's throat as it redirected its energy toward Elisa, trying to find the resistance that would sustain it, burning through its own reserves in the attempt. The wolf stirred. One amber eye focused, then the other. The massive head lifted, just slightly, just enough to turn toward Elisa, who stood in the center of the chasm with the parasite wrapped around her arms and chest and throat, her body diminishing, her hair turning silver in real time, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't have held a pen if her life depended on it. But her eyes were open, and they were calm. The wolf saw her, and something passed between them, not through the tether, not through the mechanism of her ability, but through something older and simpler. Recognition. The same recognition Jonathan had shown her on the first morning when he'd opened his amber eyes and seen her covered in his blood. "I see you in there," the wolf's gaze said. "I see you in there, and you are not nothing. You were never nothing." The parasite made a sound, not audible, felt, a vibration of desperation, of hunger turning to starvation, of a predator realizing that its prey has become its prison. It contracted again, tightened around Elisa, pulled with everything it had. She absorbed it, all of it, the last reserve of its cursed energy, the final fragments of Wallace Paul's wolf that had been planted like poison seeds 23 years ago. She took it in and let it pass through her and felt it dissolve, not with a bang, not with a dramatic rupture, but with the quiet, anticlimactic whisper of something that had been sustained by struggle, finally encountering a body that had no struggle left to give. It starved, it thinned, it dissolved. And Jonathan Blake's wolf surged to its feet with a roar that shook the entire landscape, that shook the crater, the plain, the fading red world, And the sound was not pain. It was not desperation. It was freedom. The interior world exploded with light, amber light, the color of the king's eyes, the color of honey in a jar, the color of something ancient and alive, and no longer trapped. And Elisa felt herself being expelled from the wound, pushed out by the force of a wolf that was no longer caged, and a body that was no longer dying, and a heart that was, for the first time in 23 years, beating on its own. In the great hall, the world came apart. Jonathan Blake shifted. Not the partial, failed, agonized attempts that had characterized 23 years of fighting a parasite that intercepted every transformation. This was complete, total, instantaneous. One moment he was a man on his knees, wounded, bleeding, dying, and the next moment the man was gone, and in his place was a wolf the size of a nightmare, black, massive, the largest wolf anyone in that hall had ever seen, larger than the legends, larger than the stories, larger than the fearful whispers that border packs shared around fires when they spoke of the Alpha King in the north. His wolf filled the space around him like a detonation, and the sound it made, the howl that ripped from its throat and echoed off the stone walls and shook the iron chandeliers, was felt in every wolf body within a mile. A declaration, a return, an announcement that the thing they'd been trying to kill for 23 years was not only alive, but awake and whole and absolutely, catastrophically furious. The three wolves that had been circling him didn't run. They should have. They were dead before the thought of running could form. The Alpha King moving through them like a black wind, his jaws closing with a force that ended arguments permanently. It wasn't a fight. It was a correction. Miranda Simon, still in her midnight black wolf form, fell back. Not in fear, in recognition. She'd been fighting to protect a dying king. The thing that stood in the great hall now didn't need protection. It needed space. And everything with survival instincts was giving it exactly that. The attackers broke. The ones who could still run, ran. The ones who couldn't, pinned by palace guards, wounded by Miranda's precise violence, or simply frozen by the sight of the Alpha King in full, uncursed, unleashed form, surrendered or died. The battle that had been raging through the palace corridors collapsed inward like a wave retreating from a shore, pulled back by the gravitational force of a predator so dominant that its mere presence rewrote the hierarchy of every wolf in range. It was over in minutes. Less. And then the wolf turned. The great hall fell silent. Pack leaders, guards, diplomats, attackers. Every eye watched as the massive black wolf crossed the blood-slicked floor with strides that covered meters, heading not for the shattered doors or the fleeing enemies or the strategic choke points that a military mind would prioritize, heading for the woman lying motionless on the stone floor where the king had knelt. Elisa was not moving. The marks on her skin, the map of Jonathan's wounds that she'd worn for weeks, were fading. The gray in her hair had consumed nearly all the dark, leaving it silver white, the hair of a woman decades older than 22. Her hands, lying open at her sides, were still. No tremor, no movement at all. The wolf reached her, lowered its massive head, pressed its nose to her chest, to the place directly over her heart, the mirror point of the wound she'd pressed her palm against so many times that the gesture had become a language between them. Her heart was beating. Barely. A flutter. A suggestion of rhythm rather than rhythm itself. The barest thread of life still running through a body that had given everything. Every year, every reserve, every cell of vitality, to dissolve a curse that had defeated wolves and healers and armies for 2 decades. The wolf made a sound, not a howl, not a snarl, a sound that had no name in any language, human or animal, the sound of something that has just been freed from a cage, only to discover that the person who freed it is dying on the floor. And then the wolf did what Elisa had done for it. The tether between them, the 14-step radius that had bound her to him, the filament that had stretched across 200 yards and refused to break, blazed to life. not the one-directional flow that had characterized their connection until now, with his pain pouring into her body. This was the reverse. The wolf, free now, blazing with the full, unchecked power of an alpha in his prime, opened the tether wide and pushed. Life force. Raw, unfiltered, volcanic. The energy of a wolf that had been caged for 23 years and had 23 years of accumulated power to spend. It flooded through the tether and into Elisa's body with a force that made her back arch off the stone floor, that made the silver in her hair shiver and retreat, that made her stopped hands clench and her silent lungs gasp and her failing heart seize and then beat. Hard. Once. And again. And again. The wolf pushed harder, not gently, not carefully, with the desperate, all-consuming intensity of a creature that understood, on a cellular level, that the woman on the floor had walked into its cage and taken the chains onto herself, and it would not let her carry them alone. Color returned to her skin. The silver in her hair stopped spreading, held, then slowly, strand by strand, began to darken. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes smoothed, the tremor-damaged nerves in her hands repaired, rebuilt, restored by a force that wasn't healing in any medical sense, but was something older and more fundamental, one life force reaching for another across the smallest distance in the world and refusing to let go. The wolf pressed its head to her chest, amber eyes closed. The great hall was silent. Elisa breathed. Deep. Full. The breath of a body that had been returned to itself. Not the same as before, not unchanged, but alive. Genuinely, fully, impossibly alive. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of the great hall swam above her, vaulted stone and iron chandeliers and the haze of smoke from the battle. The massive weight of the wolf's head rested on her chest, and she could feel its heartbeat through its skull, steady, strong, synchronized with hers. Two hearts, beating in the same rhythm, connected by a tether that was no longer a chain. She raised one hand. It didn't tremble. She placed it on the wolf's head, on the coarse, dark fur, on the warmth of the living animal that had been caged and freed and had used its freedom to save her. The wolf exhaled. That sound, that long, shuddering release. She'd heard it through a wall. She'd felt it through a tether. Now she felt it against her own chest, the breath of a man who had been drowning for 23 years and had finally, completely, irrevocably surfaced. And then, in the silence of the great hall, surrounded by the wreckage of a battle and the stunned faces of 6 pack leaders and 100 witnesses, Elisa felt something stir inside her own body. Not the tether, not the echo of Jonathan's wolf. Something else. Something that had been buried so deep, pressed so far down by years of being told she was empty and defective and wolfless, that it had become indistinguishable from silence. It moved, stretched, yawned awake with the slow, cautious emergence of something that had been sleeping in a very dark place for a very long time, and wasn't sure yet whether it was safe to come out. Her wolf. Small, silver, quiet, like a candle flame in a cathedral, tiny against the vastness of the space it occupied, but alive, present, real. It had always been there, buried under the weight of a life that had never given it reason to surface. A wolf needs a pack to emerge, needs belonging, needs recognition, needs the call of another wolf saying, "I see you. You are one of us. You are not nothing." Jonathan's wolf had called, not with dominance, not with alpha command, with the thing Elisa had given him in the crater, the thing that had dissolved the parasite, the thing that the parasite had never encountered and couldn't survive. Acceptance. Pure. Unconditional. The recognition of one wounded thing by another. And her wolf, hearing that call from a place deeper than trauma, deeper than conditioning, deeper than 22 years of being told she was empty, woke up. Elisa shifted. It hurt, not like she'd expected, not the violent, bone-cracking transformation she'd witnessed in other wolves. It was slower, gentler, like ice melting, like a seed breaking soil. Her body didn't tear itself apart and reassemble, it simply became. The boundaries between her human form and the wolf inside her thinned and dissolved, and she flowed from one to the other with the natural ease of water finding its level. The wolf that stood in the great hall was small, silver-white. Its eyes were the same dark brown as Elisa's, warm and deep and steady. It stood on legs that trembled, not with weakness, but with the overwhelm of a body experiencing itself for the first time. New muscles, new senses, a world suddenly expanded to include smells and sounds and frequencies that her human form had never accessed. The black wolf, Jonathan, raised his massive head and looked at the silver wolf standing where Elisa had lain. And if wolves could weep, the sound he made was the closest approximation, a low, resonant note that vibrated through the hall and settled into the bones of every person and wolf present. Not a howl of triumph, a howl of recognition. I see you in there. I always saw you. The silver wolf pressed its head against the black wolf's chest, scar to scar. The mark on her palm aligned with the mark over his heart. Even in wolf form, the geography of their shared wounds persisted. The great hall remained silent. Pack leaders stared. Guards lowered their weapons. Miranda Simon, shifting back to human form, stood among the wreckage with blood on her face and an expression that Elisa would later learn was the closest Miranda had ever come to crying. The silver wolf and the black wolf stood together in the ruined hall, breathing in unison, heartbeat to heartbeat, scar to scar. And outside the palace walls, for the first time in 23 years, the wolves of the territory lifted their heads and howled. Not in fear, not in mourning, in answer. Their king had returned, and he had not returned alone. Epilogue. 1 year later. The gardens were the first thing she'd changed, not by ordering them trimmed or replanted or restored to the geometric precision they'd once displayed in some architect's original vision. Elisa had looked at the overgrown hedges, the wild roses climbing the cracked fountain basins, the mosaic pathways disappearing under moss and clover, and she'd said, "Leave them, but tend them." It had confused the groundskeepers at first. Tend them how, exactly, if not by cutting back the wildness? But over the months, they'd come to understand what she meant. The vines stayed, but were guided, trained along trellises instead of pulling apart the walls. The roses kept their sprawl, but the dead wood was cleared so the living branches could breathe. The fountains were repaired, and water flowed again, but it flowed through channels softened by moss rather than scrubbed stone. The gardens were wild and cared for at the same time. They were allowed to be what they were, but someone was paying attention. Someone had decided the wildness was worth maintaining. It was, the palace staff whispered to each other, a decent metaphor for the woman herself. Elisa sat at the writing desk in the Eastern Garden House. The same desk, the same house, though both had changed in the way that places change when they stop being cages and start being homes. The wobble-free surface was covered in papers, reports from the territory's healers, correspondence from pack leaders requesting her presence, and a half-finished letter to Dorothy Charles, who had settled in a small village on the western border and was, according to her last message, teaching the local children to read with the aggressive pragmatism of a woman who had survived 3 tribute convoys and was not about to be defeated by a room full of 6-year-olds. The morning light came through the window, the same narrow window that had once shown her a slice of sky that changed color like a slow conversation. Jonathan had offered to have it widened. She'd refused. She liked the narrowness. It forced the light to be specific, to choose a single angle and commit to it, and the resulting beam that fell across her desk each morning was so precise and golden that it felt like the sun was pointing at something. Today it was pointing at her hands. She held them up, turned them. The tremor was gone, had been gone since the night in the Great Hall, since Jonathan's wolf had poured 23 years of accumulated power through the tether and burned the damage out of her body. Her hands were steady, young. the hands of a 23-year-old woman who had aged a decade in a month, and then had those years returned to her in a single, violent act of refusal by a wolf that did not accept the concept of losing her. Almost young. There was one mark that remained, a scar on her right palm, small, circular, slightly raised, the place where she'd pressed her hand to the wound over his heart so many times that the contact had left a permanent impression. Not a wound, a callus of connection. The skin there was smoother than the rest of her palm, polished by repeated contact with his chest, the way river stones are polished by water. She closed her hand around it, felt the familiar, phantom warmth, the echo of his heartbeat that she carried in her palm like a coin she'd never spend. The territory had changed. Not overnight. Territories don't transform on the schedule of fairy tales, no matter how dramatic the catalyst. The transformation was slower, more practical, and significantly more contentious than any story would suggest. The tribute system was the first thing Jonathan abolished. He'd signed the decree a week after the battle, sitting upright in his bed for the first time in decades, with Eliza beside him, and Nathaniel hovering with the anxious energy of a healer who had just watched every medical assumption he'd ever held get demolished and was still recalibrating. The decree was 3 sentences long. Jonathan Blake was not a man who wasted words on paper any more than he wasted them in conversation. And it ended 40 years of border packs sending their disposable people to be drained in the name of a treaty. The political fallout had been considerable. Solomon Hess had aged visibly managing it, his gaunt frame somehow growing gaunter as he navigated the diplomatic labyrinth of pack leaders who had been sending tributes for so long that they'd built entire social structures around the practice. Who was disposable and who was valuable? Those categories had been load-bearing walls in the architecture of a dozen packs, and removing them threatened to bring the whole structure down. It was Miranda Simon who'd solved it. Or rather, Miranda Simon who'd walked into a room full of arguing pack leaders, placed both hands on the table, and said in her flat, factual voice, "You're debating whether to keep a system that feeds people to a curse that no longer exists. The curse is gone. The king is whole. If you need a new basis for your treaties, I suggest you find one that doesn't require human sacrifice, because the woman who ended the curse is now the king's mate, and she has opinions about people being treated as cargo." She'd looked at Elisa when she said it, and Elisa had seen, in that glance, the thing that had been growing between them over the past year. Not friendship exactly, but something adjacent to it. Mutual recognition. The acknowledgement of 2 women who occupied very different spaces in the world, but shared a single, unshakable commitment to the truth, however inconvenient. Miranda hadn't stayed at the palace. She'd returned to the Southern Reach after the battle, her potential mating with Jonathan dissolved by mutual agreement and without drama. "He was never going to mate with me," she'd told Elisa before leaving, with the characteristic bluntness that made her either the most refreshing or the most terrifying person in any room. "I knew that the moment I saw the way he looked at the wall between your chambers. A man who stares at a wall like it's keeping him from breathing is not a man who's available for political arrangements." She'd paused at the garden gate, turned back. "Take care of him. He's more fragile than he looks." "I know," Elisa had said. "I know you know. That's why I'm leaving him with you." The title they'd invented for her, healer consort, had started as a bureaucratic necessity and become something the territory had never seen before. She walked the villages, not as queen, not as ruler, not as the alpha's mate performing the ceremonial obligations of her station. She walked them as the woman with the scar on her palm and the small silver wolf that trotted beside her when she traveled in shifted form. A wolf so quiet and unassuming that people often didn't notice it until it was sitting at their feet, and then they'd look down and find a pair of warm brown eyes looking back at them with an attention so complete it felt like being seen for the first time. She absorbed pain. Still. Carefully now, Nathaniel had established protocols, limits, a schedule that prevented her from taking on more than her body could process. She'd sit with the sick, the wounded, the grieving, place her hands on them, take just enough of their suffering to give them room to breathe, to think, to begin the slow work of healing themselves. She didn't cure anyone. That wasn't the point. The point was the moment, the exact, specific moment when a person in pain feels someone else acknowledge that pain without flinching, without looking away, without calculating its cost. The moment when suffering is witnessed, and the witness doesn't leave. That was what she gave them. Presence, the thing she'd been starved of her entire life, offered now to people who were starving in the same way she'd starved. She was, the territory was beginning to understand, the most valuable thing the palace had ever acquired. Not because of her ability, because of what her ability meant, that pain was not something to be hidden or hoarded or weaponized, but something to be shared, carried, made lighter by the simple, radical act of not looking away. Jonathan found her in the garden at dusk. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps, which were silent with the predatory quiet of a wolf in human skin, but the tether. It hummed when he was close, not with pain anymore. That frequency had been gone since the night the parasite dissolved. The hum now was something else, warmer, steadier. The frequency of two bodies that had been inside each other's worst moments and had come out the other side still reaching. He appeared at the edge of the garden path. He was in human form. He shifted freely now, effortlessly, the casual back and forth between man and wolf that characterized alphas who had never been cursed and had full command of their dual nature. But he chose human form for this, for her, because the things he wanted to say required a human mouth, and because she had fallen in love with the man before she'd ever seen the wolf, and he never let her forget that he remembered that. He was enormous. A year of restored health had returned him to the full physical magnitude that his body had always been designed for. Broad, dense, built with the unapologetic solidity of a man whose genetics had been arguing in favor of dominance for 1,000 generations. The scars were gone, all except one, the thin line over his heart where the oldest wound had been, where her palm had pressed, where the parasite had lived and died and been dissolved by a woman who understood pain better than pain understood itself. He sat beside her on the garden bench. The wood creaked under his weight. He didn't speak immediately. Jonathan Blake was a man who treated words like ammunition, never wasting a round, always waiting for the clear shot. She leaned into him, her shoulder against his arm, the scar on her palm finding, through fabric and muscle, the scar on his chest. The tether hummed. "The convoy from the Eastern Territories arrived today," he said. She nodded. She'd felt them, the distant echo of suffering that always preceded a group of displaced people. Not tributes anymore, refugees. Families from packs that had collapsed in the restructuring following the abolition of the tribute system, their social hierarchies suddenly without the load-bearing wall of disposability, their communities fracturing along lines that had been hidden by the old cruelty. "How many?" she asked. 47, 12 children. She closed her eyes, felt them, 47 points of pain on the edge of her awareness, some sharp, some dull, all carrying the specific frequency of people who had been uprooted and didn't know yet whether the place they'd arrived at would treat them as people or as problems. "I'll go to them in the morning," she said. "I know." A silence, comfortable, the silence of two people who had learned to communicate through walls and tethers and shared wounds, and had discovered that spoken language, while useful, was often the least efficient channel available to them. "Your sister would have liked the gardens," Elisa said. Jonathan went still beside her, not the rigid stillness of pain, the held-breath stillness of a man hearing something unexpected that has landed in a place he didn't know was still tender. "The moon petals," Elisa continued. "I found some, growing wild by the eastern wall. They must have been here all along, buried under the overgrowth, blooming every 3 years for no one." She paused. "I asked the groundskeepers to clear the area around them. Give them light. They'll bloom again next spring." His arm moved, settled around her shoulders, heavy, warm. The weight of it was grounding, an anchor, a declaration. the physical grammar of a man who expressed himself through proximity and pressure rather than words. Teresa would have found them herself, he said. She would have climbed the wall and gotten dirt in her hair and come running back with a fistful of them before anyone knew she was gone. Elisa smiled. She could see it. The memory she'd absorbed, the girl in the field with the flowers held up like a trophy. But the memory didn't hurt anymore. It had been processed, metabolized, transformed from a wound into something else. Something that ached, yes, but ached the way muscles ache after good work. The ache of something that had been used and was stronger for it. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Elisa said. She sounds like you. She looked up at him. His amber eyes, warm, clear, present, looked back at her. And in them she saw the thing she'd first felt through a stone wall, in the dark, in the space between two damaged people learning to trust the sound of each other's breathing. Not love, not yet. Love was what it became, but what she saw in his eyes was what it had been first, and what it would always be underneath everything else. I see you. All of you. The broken parts and the whole parts, and the parts you think are defects. I see them, and I'm not looking away. He leaned down, pressed his forehead to hers. Scar to scar was their language, but this was something newer, softer. The gesture of a man who had spent 23 years unable to touch anyone without hurting them, learning that touch could be gentle, that proximity didn't have to cost. Stay, he said. Not a command, not an alpha's order, a request. From the man behind the wolf, behind the king, behind the scars. I'm here, she said. In the distance, at the palace gates, the convoy of 47 displaced people waited with hollow eyes and rope-marked wrists, and the desperate, extinguished hope of bodies that had been counted and found disposable. Elisa stood. Jonathan watched her go, his mate, his healer, the woman who had walked into his wounds and dissolved the thing that was killing him by doing nothing more radical than refusing to look away from his pain. She walked down the garden path toward the gates, and her silver wolf flickered at the edges of her human form, not shifting, not yet, but present, visible. A quiet announcement to anyone who looked closely enough: this woman is not empty. This woman was never empty. You just weren't looking in the right place. He watched her reach the gates, watched her kneel beside a child, a girl, maybe 7, with wide eyes and a bruise on her arm that Elisa's hand moved toward instinctively, automatically, with the reflexive compassion of a body that had been built to carry other people's pain and had finally found a world that called it a gift instead of a curse. The Alpha King, Jonathan Blake, terror of the Northern Territories, the man whose name made border packs lower their voices, the man who had been dying for 23 years and had been saved by the one person everyone else had thrown away, leaned back on the garden bench and watched the woman he loved kneel in the dirt and take a child's small hand and hold it. And he smiled. It was not a king's smile. It was not an alpha's smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally, after everything, the curse, the betrayal, the decades of wounds that wouldn't close, the parasite that fed on his wolf, the impossible girl who had dissolved it all by simply refusing to stop feeling, understood the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. What is the opposite of a curse? Not a blessing, not power, not magic. Someone who stays. Dear viewers, as we come to the end of Elisa's story, I want to leave you with just one thought. The people who threw her away didn't know what they had, but here's the question that keeps me up at night. How many people in your life are carrying something extraordinary inside them, and nobody's bothered to look? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story made you feel something, anything, that like button is right there. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to this channel. We'll see you in the next one.